Ascending the Global Culture of Economics and Politics Series, Part 1, A Revelation for Mankind by Edward D.R. James. In the next 30 to 60 years, our children will die or live through a full-blown Mad Max scenario, which was a movie depicting life in a post-apocalyptic dystopia. This isn't just my view, nor does it border on the fringes of conspiracy as some mainstream analysts may suggest. No, in fact, the alarm bells are and have been sounding for decades by highly esteemed experts in their respective fields, more notably in the environmental sciences and through a great number of economists. Even politicians like the acclaimed former Vice President Al Gore have been warning us of this inconvenient truth, as well as sports icons, entertainment moguls, and A-list celebs like Leonardo DiCaprio have been pleading for our action in this 11th hour of humanity. The Global Water Security Report from the U.S. Director of National Intelligence in 2012 stated that the water demand is set to outstrip sustainable current supplies by 40% by 2030. This quote aired in the documentary Breath of Life, which also claimed that by 2050, food demand will increase by 70%. The world population will likely peak at around 9.4 billion around 2070 and then decline to around 9 billion by the year 2100, according to the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. As if overpopulation wasn't enough, the stresses on the food demand will be further exacerbated by a dwindling food supply, a nutrient-deficient soil, and the exposed risks of our monoculture farming practices. Cynthia Matsky, a marine biologist interviewed in The Breath of Life, said the fossil fuels that we burn as they settle out into the oceans are changing the chemistry to the point that within the next 50 years, the ocean may not be able to sustain plankton, the very base of the food chain, because the acidity eats away at the exoskeletons of a lot of the different types of plankton. I suppose we can all agree that as the plankton goes, so goes the marine wildlife. Our oceans absorb 25 times more heat than our atmosphere, and the documentary showed a table of atmospheric CO2 levels in parts per million, ppm, according to the year. In 1990, the atmospheric CO2 levels were 350 ppm. In 2014, it was 400 parts per million, and in the year 2100, it is projected to be 800 parts per million. The big problem is coral reefs stop growing at 450 parts per million and will begin to dissolve at 550 parts per million. This table was included in a report for the World Bank Potsdam Institute. Coral reefs and a multitude of their ecosystems attract some of the most dense populations of life and biodiversity in the world, and our current economic and political systems have devastated them, so much that it baffles me when someone can see pictures of bleached coral reefs or toxic dumping dead zones with rotting carcasses of fish and fowl, or seemingly endless tracks of oil spills, or trash and plastic gyros floating about, or hear of mass species extinction and still not be moved to demand change. The problems of food sources on land are likewise severe. The documentary stated that there is no city more than 3 days away from a revolution, and that's because of food supply. Our industries have perfected just-in-time delivery so that everything is produced and delivered to industries and to your stores just as it's needed. No one keeps stockpiles anymore because it's too expensive and it's inefficient. But what this means is that our production and delivery systems are highly vulnerable to disruption. When it comes to soil, the nostalgia of that nursery rhyme, Old MacDonald Had a Farm, no longer applies. Mia MacDonald, executive director of Brighter Green, was interviewed in the brilliant documentary Time to Choose. MacDonald said, "In America, Less than 4% total of farm acres are dedicated to either fruits or vegetables or tree nuts. It's a tiny proportion. This system has become unsustainable. It takes up to 10 times more land to feed ourselves with meat as it does to feed ourselves with plants. As a result, 30% of the Earth's land is now being used for the production of livestock, the giant lagoons that store their waste and the vast areas needed to grow their food. In my opinion, that 30% land use going to livestock is important because there are those who believe we need more earths to sustain ourselves. However, if the majority of us commit to a vegan lifestyle where we avoid the consumption of animal products or commit to a vegetarian lifestyle where dairy and eggs are acceptable, then we will transition that land use to diversify our crops for direct human consumption. That way, we won't need to look for other planets to plunder, exploit, or terraform. Besides, if we wanted to practice terraforming, I say we refocus on Earth and mitigate, if not eliminate, the entirety of pollution itself. Flowing into a different discussion, Dr. Russell Mittermeier, president of Conservation International, proclaimed, "A forest generates its own rainfall." As the documentary points out, much of our water supply in southern Brazil depends on the forest in the north. As those forests disappear, so does the water. Since 2040, Brazil has experienced severe water shortages for the first time in its history. For Sao Paulo, a city of 20 million, this has become a crisis. Another interviewee said there are places where we don't have water half of the week. We are still seeing tensions between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, population 12 million. Because Rio needs the water to produce energy, but Sao Paulo needs the water for the people. And they are fighting on how to use this water, something we couldn't imagine 10 years ago. Another excellent documentary, The Corporation, discussed Bolivia's fight against the privatization of their water, a condition imposed by the World Bank in order for the Bolivian government to receive financing. There, on the streets of Cochabamba, the unthinkable happened. The Bechtel Corporation attempted to expand its privatization of water to prohibit people from collecting rainwater. The Bolivian government tried to defend its corporation's right to charge people living on $2 a day up to a quarter of their income for water. The interviewee, Oscar Oliveira, from the Coalition in Defense of Water and Life, commented on the protesters. There were hundreds of young people, 16 or 17 years old, who lost their arms or legs or who were left handicapped for life by brain injuries. And Victor Hugo Daza was killed. In the end, the Bolivian people were able to defeat the corporate Goliath, and rightfully so. Here in the United States, lakes and reservoirs that provide municipal drinking water to the people of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania are now at risk for fracking contamination, just as the fossil fuel companies have exposed risks and allegedly poisoned the private wells of homeowners all across America, and no doubt the world. But not to worry about your pensions, folks. These corporations will settle out of court, only to deny any wrongdoing. Our water tables are also dried out, especially in the West. However, in Florida, saltwater intrusion is threatening the freshwater aquifers due to the rising sea levels. Clearly, this obsolete economic and political system has done nothing to overcome the challenges of maintaining and expanding our supply of drinking water. Unfortunately, the rising seawaters provide buoyancy to other problems contributing to the future Mad Max movie scenarios. Or should I use a more fitting historical analogy of Noah's great flood? In today's modern world, though, the entity NOAA spells its name NOAA, the acronym for National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Scientists here project the global sea level will rise up to 6.6 feet, 2 meters, by the end of this century, affecting almost 40% of the people here in the United States who live in coastal areas. As the tides roll in on global coastlines, another estimate has over 600 million people's homes being flooded or dragged out to sea. South Florida political leaders have adopted a unified sea level rise projection calculated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which project a 3 to 7 inch rise by the year 2030 and a 9 to 24 inch rise by the year 2060. Whether or not you believe in climate change, one cannot deny that in recent years, the city of Miami Beach has suffered flooding without any rain, which has never happened decades prior. Miami Beach Mayor Philip Levine stated that the governor of Florida and the Department of Transportation unfortunately don't believe in sea level rise, even if they were shown some fish on the street. Mayor Levine later said that they have a $400 million citywide plan to install one-way storm drain valves and pumps, raise the seawalls, and raise the height of their roads. So they need the state and federal funding. In comparing water-drenched wallets, CNN reported that according to FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, the total damages for Hurricane Katrina alone estimated at $108 billion, while other sources estimate over $200 billion. The rising cost of damages and rebuilding systems like the sewer and freshwater supply systems, power systems, and other risks attached to it, like Fukushima's nuclear material spreading into the oceans, are not the only problems that come with the rising seas. Other than the obvious change in climate patterns, there are population displacement challenges, the physical and psychological trauma associated with it, and the increased tensions that build between different groups of peoples due to scarce resources, just to name a few. Suffice to say, the obstacles ahead of us in the coming decades are just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Underneath it all is this behemoth infrastructure of an obsolete economic and political paradigm, where the rules are for the most part rigged and the wealth is unfairly distributed to the established few. Nobel laureate and economic guru Joseph Stiglitz once said, "The average cow in Europe receives a subsidy of close to $2 a day." That's a number that resonates because the World Bank defines poverty as living under $2 a day. 40% of people in the world live on less than $2 a day. It is better to be a cow in Europe than to be an average person in the developing world. When I first heard this statement, it sent chills down my spine. I thought to myself, in part, this is why some of the ultra-wealthy treat those with little money with so little compassion. The rules of this money game make it so easy for them to regard people as animals who are even lower than the cattle they own. So I ask you who are listening or reading this message, can you honestly say that the current economy has improved the lives of the poor by leaps and bounds in between its cycles of booms and busts? Before the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009, there had been no less than 71 systemic banking crises in the past 140 years, 1870 to 2009, in the 14 countries for which we have a detailed body of historical financial data, reads a grim statement by Moritz Schullerich, a professor of economics at the Free University of Berlin. That averages out to be about one economic crisis every 2 years. Unfortunately, as we move forward, past is prelude. In May 2017, CNBC.com posted an article claiming future generations are on course to become enveloped in the biggest pension crisis in history, according to the World Economic Forum, unless policymakers from the world's leading economies take urgent action. Analysis from the World Economic Forum, or WEF, showed 6 countries with the biggest pensions, including the US, Canada, UK, Netherlands, Japan, and Australia, as well as the two most densely populated countries in the world, China and India, would face a retirement savings gap in excess of $400 trillion in the year 2050, up from around $70 trillion in 2015. Increase in the longevity and rapidly aging populations around the world is the financial equivalent to climate change. The Standard & Poor's report Global Aging 2010 announced key findings regarding the effects of population aging on public expenditure programs like Social Security and Medicare and interest payments. It estimated that by the year 2030, the net debt burden is projected to be at almost 90% of GDP and will be on an explosive path to almost 245% of GDP by the year 2050. That being said, I must say that I disagree with the tone of these reports. I would not be so hard on the elderly. They are our parents and grandparents. They've made their sacrifices, performed to the best of their abilities, and deserve all our love and respect. The seniors helped advance our society to the levels we have today. And as the younger generations take up the mantle, may we learn from their experiences and elevate our lives and culture to heights that would make them proud. Going back to these mind-blowing numbers, for 2016, the World Bank reported our collective global GDP, otherwise known as Gross World Product, GWP, was $75.8 trillion, with the U.S. touting the highest gross domestic product, GDP, at $18.6 trillion, albeit exposing a national debt of over $13 trillion back then. Of course, what good is a world GDP if not compared to a world debt? This past January, while referring to the Institute of International Finance, BusinessInsider.com wrote that the global debt soared to a record $233 trillion in the third quarter of 2017. That marked a $16.5 trillion or 8% increase from the end of 2016. The global ratio of debt to gross domestic product now sits at 318%. The global indebtedness sorted by sector reads: government at $63 trillion, non-financial corporates $68 trillion, financial sector $58 trillion, household $44 trillion. It also reflected record highs for private non-financial sector debt in Canada, France, Hong Kong, Korea, Switzerland, and Turkey. Perhaps our paychecks have been looking quite jaundiced lately, coupled with inflating health insurance premiums, deductibles, tuition, municipal and property taxes, and so on, leaving us little choice but to charge our credit cards on many purchases. In early January, NYDailyNews.com posted, credit card debt in the U.S. hit an all-time high. The $1.023 trillion in revolving credit as of November 2017 is slightly higher than the previous benchmark set right before the Great Recession in 2008. Debt such as student and car loans, otherwise known as non-revolving credit, also ticked up during the one-month period to $2.804 trillion, according to the Fed data. We know all too well how stagnant our wages have been. Fortunately, though, there are a number of economists who aren't taking this lightly. The Economic Policy Institute has a nominal wage tracker webpage claiming that it will take a wage growth of at least 3.5 to 4% for workers to begin to reap the benefits of economic growth and to achieve a genuine recovery from the Great Recession. However, nominal wage growth have been far below target in the recovery. The EPI's chart regarding the year-over-year change in private sector nominal average hourly earnings 2007 to 2017 showed 2.3% in December 2017 for production non-supervisory workers and 2.5% for all non-farm employees, which has gyrated sideways from August of 2009's data of 2.6% for production slash non-supervisory workers and 2.4% from all non-farm employees. That's over a ridiculous 8 years of stagnant wages. If that's not depressing enough for you, indicators say we're saving a lot less these days. In December of 2012, our personal savings was 11%. It has dropped to the lowest it's been since then, down to 2.9% last November, according to FRED, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Interestingly, the last time we saved in the 2% range was late 2007, just as the Great Recession was beginning to rumble. But hey, I guess we have to count our blessings, right? Thank our lucky stars that we still have a job and just not ask for that raise. Or fear we'll be next on the chopping block when the boss decides that payroll needs to lose some dead weight. After all, who knows when the next bubble might burst? The next financial specter could be in bold print on tomorrow's front pages, probably when we least expect it. Already, the news cycle a plethora of headlines regarding people gaming the money system by hook or by crook. The hacking of Equifax resulting in the theft of 145 million Social Security numbers, Wells Fargo Bank's forgery of creating millions of accounts, Barclays and USB's manipulation of the LIBOR rates, money laundering allegations from HSBC and Standard Chartered, drug companies price gouging its patients like Mylan Pharmaceuticals, inflating the price of EpiPen from $100 in 2009 to over $600, and Turin Pharmaceuticals jacking up the price of Duraprim from $13.50 per tablet to $750. How about the insider trading scandals like former Goldman Sachs director Rajat Gupta leaking tips to hedge fund billionaire Raj Rajaratnam, or the infamous Bernie Madoff's $50 billion Ponzi scheme, or the accounting scams of WorldCom, Enron, and Arthur Andersen, to name a few. Most recently, articles have been riddled with impending store closures and job losses. USA Today reported General Electric to cut 12,000 jobs in its power division. CNN Money said Walmart spokesperson Greg Hitt estimated that roughly 9,450 people are employed across the 63 stores they are planning to close. Retail giant Macy's will cut 5,000 jobs and will close 7 more stores in Florida, California, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Vermont. The moves are part of a plan announced in August of 2016 to close 100 stores, according to NBC. The Washington Post reported that the Limited has posted a message on its website saying it is closing all of its 250 stores nationwide. The closure would result in about 4,000 job cuts. PacSun, Aeropostale, and American Apparel each have filed for bankruptcy protection in the past year and are aiming to reorganize. Last month, Business Insider published an article stating the mall crisis is secretly morphing into a full-on Armageddon. Some retailers are choosing to let leases expire instead of closing stores, and that number is not accounted for in store closure numbers. This could mean that the retail apocalypse is worse than previously thought. A Business Insider analysis of announcements from 2017 found that an estimated 8,000 stores either closed that year or were slated to close in the near future. Other terrifying threats in the news are foreign and ghastly. Early this January, a New York Times headline read, "Trump says his nuclear button is much bigger than North Korea's." Last December, A Newsweek headline reads, Middle East War, Iran's allies are secretly launching missiles at Saudi Arabia as Tehran takes control in the battle for dominance. More and more, it appears to be a race between potty-mouthed presidents and allies clutching their hair-triggered treaties as to who will be fool enough to step off the threshold and deliver us all to the horsemen of war. Even if we wipe off our war paint, foreign challengers may reframe the portrait of the American economy. A Monday morning headline reads, This One Belt One Road map shows China's unstoppable global growth. This past January, Bloomberg News published an article claiming that senior government officials in Beijing reviewing the nation's foreign exchange holdings have recommended slowing or halting purchases of U.S. treasuries. China holds the world's largest foreign exchange reserves at $3.1 trillion and regularly assesses its strategies for investing them. An oilprice.com headline reads, Will the dollar survive the petro-yuan? If China has their way and stifles the U.S. Treasury bonds as well as the petrodollar, then their influence will have far-reaching negative effects. For instance, Pakistan's central bank recently announced that it has allowed the Chinese yuan to be used for bilateral trade and investment activities, a move which could replace the U.S. dollar for transactions in the $50 billion China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. As we witness China's initiative for global dominance hitting its stride, to some degree, I can appreciate President Obama's pivot to Asia campaign. However, to an even greater degree, I could not understand nor could I ever endorse a TPP policy that would allow the transfer of immense power over to the corporations. The lack of transparency in the details of such a policy and the urgency to cram it down Congress's throat was particularly nauseating to observe. However, nothing smells more putrefying than the Supreme Court's 2010 campaign finance ruling for Citizens United. It allowed well-financed corporations and lesser-funded unions to donate unlimited sums of money to their candidates' political action committees. During an interview with the New Republic, when asked what's the worst ruling the current court has produced, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg answered, If there was one decision I would overrule, it would be Citizens United. I think the notion that we have all the democracy that money can buy strays far from what our democracy is supposed to be. I believe this heinous ruling was a complete distortion of Republican virtues, which led to a TPP-like tightening of the corporation's grip over the three branches of our government, essentially confirming the ultra-wealthy as the hidden fourth branch of our government. To attain the fifth branch, they must acquire the complete control over the news media. For decades, they've been chipping away at our First Amendment's freedom of the press, when investigative journalists have been fired and exposés canceled because they stepped on the toes or got too close to the truth of corporate sponsors, partners, and power structures. So, for the most part, abuses of the corporatocracy are watered down and sanitized from mainstream media's narrative when the higher-ups do allow such exposure. Consider the influence of the top 5 to 25 multimedia corporations. Some suggest they control the majority of information, possibly up to 90%, that most Americans tune into. Realize this: when the wealth of information is controlled by the hands of the few, they effectively control our perceptions, due diligence, and decisions. Ultimately, they control the culture that we'd like to think we shape. Given the modus operandi of news narratives, Healthy doses of skepticism taken with your regular meal of network and alternative news is the best discipline to prescribe. It must feel real cozy, though, for the multinational megalomaniacs to sit atop their gold-plated bidets and watch the Trump administration represent them, deregulating our agencies like the FCC, repealing net neutrality, rewriting environmental rules to permit more pollution and less penalties, overhauling public land for his loyal friends in the energy sector, not unlike former Vice President Dick Cheney. How about contracting projects to build a wall for a well-connected real estate mogul? Are there no bids on this probability? Additionally, odds are the Republican Congress is colluding to gut out consumer protections from the Dodd-Frank Act, handing more get-out-of-jail cards to financial board members, bracing them for the next economic crash. One can speculate that they're all banking on Trump. But one of the biggest victories Trump delivered to the corporate deep state was the devious December tax bill. The Washington Post wrote 37 of 38 experts surveyed by the University of Chicago's Initiative on Global Markets agreed that the GOP tax bills in Congress would cause U.S. debt to increase substantially faster than the economy. The 38th misread the question. Remember, under President Eisenhower's administration, the ultra-rich paid over 90% in taxes, keeping the debt low. In part, that helped to make America great. That tax policy kept America first. That helped spur the American economy to be the best in the world. Certainly, other factors were involved back then that aren't now, but in comparison with a new tax bill, of course, our national debt will skyrocket. What else can you expect if you cut off $1.5 trillion of revenue, 14% off your revenue from the corporate tax, enact a more lax estate tax, and so on? What else can you expect when Trump approved spending $700 billion on the military a few months prior? What else can you expect when the cost of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA keep inflating? Well, if you are the establishment, you'd probably expect for the debt to be in the stratosphere, securing the central banks at the seat of the power. You'd expect that there'd be enough pandemonium on the Wall Street-Washington corridor that finally, you'll be able to privatize and own Social Security, Medicare, and other coveted federal assets, right? Well then, establishment, if you haven't already done so, you'd better put your money on Trump, the Republicans, and the corporate Democrats to get all that done for you. So, who else felt that they purposely snuck that tax bill under the establishment's Christmas tree just before the holiday break? Reminds me of an old poem. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the abode not a creature was tweeting, not even a toad. The adults were all worried, restless in bed, with flashbacks of the 1913 Federal Reserve Act lingering in our heads. Yes, folks, our dear leaders gifted the Fed to the establishment just before Christmas over 100 years ago. Ah, tradition. Gotta love it. With large permanent tax cuts for the already wealthy and a minor temporary one for the rest of us, the corporations can once again play the numbers. They'll raise some wages here, but close some stores there. They'll give some bonuses here, then cut some jobs, hours, and benefits there. They'll inject us with just enough payroll juice to catch a quick high until we're yanked back down by our household debts. And God forbid, corporate board members drop their own salaries to increase profits for shareholders. No, they'll do just enough so they have some proof when they tell us they tried to fix things. Yet, all the while, have plenty left over to fatten their portfolios, hedge their bets, and stack their chips for the pay-to-play politics, at least to get them through the next financial disaster, the next boom and bust cycle. These environmental, economic, and political problems we face aren't just structural or derived only from policy. No, more pervasive and perverse, these problems are cultural, man-made biases that undermine the very underpinnings of how each of us live and treat one another. Stripping away our integrity and dignity for the almighty dollar, unfortunately, is the presiding corporate culture. One that has mismanaged the scarcity of our resources into this zero-sum game. For me to win, you must lose. As though the puppeteers of this culture are contriving to have us at each other's throat with no signs of respite. It is obvious now that our economic system is a profit-only, GDP-based, fractional reserve Ponzi scheme. This money as debt growth model is a false profit culture, and therefore is the only false profit we must defeat by unifying our forces to divest ourselves from it. This corporatocracy capitalism, an ill-conceived service only to self culture, has always been that Antichrist, that great Satan revealed in the passages of each of our respective sacred scriptures. Dismantling the idolatry of oligarchs and the bondage of their money system is a staple meditation of any decent lover of humanity. Naturally, the questions that arise are, what do we replace it with, and how? In the coming months, I will present a series of videos and articles called Ascending the Global Culture of Economics and Politics. Like Jiu-Jitsu, it's intended to throw off any possible establishment agenda for a new world order, and it will regain command over the levers of control to be in the hands of the people. I will submit to you the initial framework for a novel economic model and propose amendments to repair our broken legislative process. This new economic model will prioritize our values to be ahead of money, one that will increase our profits by first serving others, our planet, and all of her inhabitants. I will introduce pillars of this framework, each vital to the longevity of the human race. Each must be accomplished concurrently. As I describe the core pillars, may it stir the wisdom of compassion in organizations all across the globe, especially in organizations like the Institute for New Economic Thinking, INET, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, whose members are leaders in economics, business, and politics. May it awaken the soul of every citizen, as it did me, to envision our world in complete harmony. Invigorated to serve one another, may our relationships rekindle jubilance in our hearts with each exchange. May our confidence in this new system stand as erect as the summits of justice and liberty as we continue to define the height and range of those measures. May you be inspired to passionately seek and hold the thoughts and emotions of creating a new global economic and political culture, one that extends beyond the security of mankind, enveloping all lives on Mother Earth herself. Enter the revelation model. Pillar 1, the resource-oriented economy to peg our currencies with, and the supply-demand-resupply inventory network as the job creator. A favorite chant among the establishment has been that they are the job creators. Yet, according to Breitbart, last May, the cereal giant Kellogg Company announced 185 layoffs for Kansas City. Before this, 246 employees in Florida, close to 300 in New York, and 219 more jobs lost in Minnesota. This is not to say that Kellogg represents the establishment, rather to spotlight the fact that diminishing profits and sales determines the fate of jobs. It is the customer demand that is the ultimate job creator. In his documentary, Inequality for All, the highly esteemed economist Robert Reich said, "The important thing to know is that consumer spending is 70% of the US economy, and the middle class is the heart of that consumer spending. There's no way to sustain the economy over the long term without a strong, vibrant, and growing middle class." The documentary included a venture capitalist making between $10 to $30 million annually, Nick Hanar, who agreed and said, "The problem with rising inequality is a person like me who makes 1,000 as much as the typical American does not buy 1,000 as much pillows a year. Even the richest people only sleep on 1 or 2 pillows." I mostly agree. Apparently, a person's role as the customer of hundreds, if not thousands, of goods and services has a greater effect on the velocity of money throughout the spectrum of the economy, thus the job markets, than that same person's role as an employee delivering a handful of goods and services many times over. So, in reply to the establishment, the more accurate statement is that we, the customers, are the most significant job creators. And we must insist this as fact. Proprietors, principals, and presidents of organizations, whether they are private, public, or neither, are in truth facilitators. They are the intermediaries between customers and goods and services these customers seek. Indeed, these positions are noble and worthy goals of ambitious minds. Our current culture, to some degree, however, has distorted the relationship of employer and employee to a regard that inches ever so close to that of the master and slave. They treat people like commodities, actuated into monetary risks, to be exhausted through labor until profits finally dictate the terms of their release. Those without enough, no nest egg to retire on, nor a pension to live off of, having but a handful of options, are left to seek out the next master to serve. We keep hearing stories of employees being fired prior to reaching tenure, or longtime workers being replaced with younger personnel for less pay. Our heads are barely above water when it comes to our budget, yet they threaten to take away our work hours and projects, lower our wages, and cancel our benefits. They threaten municipalities and states of moving their businesses out unless their taxes are lowered and their terms are met. Instead of protecting people's jobs, now we're hearing about the trend of these so-called job creators to replace people with robots. For the most part, employers create and protect their profits. People's jobs are expendable to them. Remember that. Let's recall Trump's deal to save around 800 workers with the HVAC maker Carrier, who went through massive rounds of layoffs this past summer. Bloomberg reported that part of the plan was for Carrier to receive $7 million worth of Indiana tax credits and training grants for the next 10 years, while their parent company, United Technologies Corp., UTC, pledged to spend $16 million upgrading its plants, which would include automation. UTC's CEO, Gregory Hayes, was quoted as saying, "We will take a lot of those jobs that today require very low skills and eliminate those jobs through automation." The article continued on saying, "Studies show that 50% to 90% of job losses at American factories are attributable to productivity gains linked to automation. Except for a blip during the 2008 recession, industrial production in the U.S. has been on a fairly steady rise for decades." If this isn't enough, there are other innovations that are devouring the labor force like a vulture. In Greg Palast's acclaimed documentary, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, he told a story of investor Paul Singer's shameful act of, as Greg stated, chewing on the corpses of the auto industry when it collapsed in 2009. 10 years earlier, to save money, General Motors had spun off its famous car parts company Delco and turned Delco into a separate company called Delphi. As part of a plan to bail out the auto industry, the government agreed to help GM buy back Delphi and save Delco's 25,000 union workers. But what GM and the government didn't know was that Paul Singer and his partner had secretly scooped up ownership of Delphi, and they told GM and the President of the United States that unless Obama gave the Singer partnership $12.9 billion, they would close down Delphi and cut off GM's parts. Without those parts, the entire auto industry would shut down forever, and over 1 million jobs would vanish. The US car czar called this demand extortion, but the US Treasury paid the $12 billion. The Singer partnership had bought Delphi stocks for 67 cents per share. With the bailout move, the shares zoomed to $22 per share. Paul Singer's cut was over $1.2 billion. Singer fired every single one of those union workers, and Delphi moved 100,000 jobs overseas, mostly to China. Certainly not all, but the behaviors of some venture capitalists resemble that of vulture capitalists. Horrific examples like these, I believe, do represent just a few bad apples, a small portion. Obviously, a greater number of our employers have the best intentions in mind for their employees, their clients, and the communities they serve. One of the ways we can further the endeavors of goodwill is by restructuring our economy to be resource-oriented. By using the systems of a resource-oriented economy, our culture will not only reframe our roles as customers to be the more significant job creators, but it will peg our currency to our resources. Instead of parlaying an economic system based on monetary profits, GDP, and bonds manipulated by bond rating agencies having conflicts of interest, and then paying off these bonds with tax formulas rigged to subjugate middle and low income Americans, as well as societies all across the globe, the revelation model will orient the economy according to the measures of our resources. The revelation model, which I'll refer to as RM, will then distribute these resources in part according to the customer's needs and desires, and the other part is through a democratic capitalism-style valuation system, which will be discussed in future videos/articles. After all, real assets provide more certainty, security, and stability. Thus, the RM will revive consumers' confidence in the markets. The RM seeks to restore the altruistic forces of supply and demand to earnestly manage scarcity and overcome the challenges of our day. So when natural disasters strike, be it hurricanes, wildfires, mudslides, earthquakes, volcanoes, even massive solar flares, budgetary reasons will not impede the delivery of relief and rebuilding efforts to its completion. For instance, the RM would remedy any shortcomings from the Trump administration's treatment of Puerto Rico and our citizens there. We will ramp up the supplies and labor and direct our resources to areas that need them, simply because they are the right things to do. With the resource-oriented economy, war will never be contrived to reset our financial woes. Through diplomacy, transparency, and agreeable measures of scientific and democratic approaches, we will distribute our resources fairly and seek to avoid war. Let wisdom and compassion guide humanity in all our countries, with both the military and civilians marching for peace. The revelation model seeks to level the playing field and mitigate, if not eliminate, the socio-economic supremacy complexes that has ravaged the histories of countless nations. The RM seeks to make reasonable adjustments needed for population growth and the usage rate of our resources to match or even better the Earth's capacity to replenish those resources. Following the ways of sustainability will fulfill our calling in the book of Genesis that we, the people, are to be good stewards of this planet, our most precious gift. The resource-oriented economy under the RM will achieve these goals by creating and maintaining the public information technology, infrastructure, and support systems needed to manage the supply, demand, and resupply of goods and services. This means that the items and services we purchase will be registered and tracked through the public supply demand resupply inventory network. These purchases will be encrypted in order to maintain privacy. Each household, organization, and place of business will be able to spontaneously walk into any store and purchase items and services as they do now. They can place their orders over the phone or online for pickup or delivery as they do now. You see, it's imperative to construct a system that is similar enough to minimize disruptions within our communities, yet different enough to incite meaningful change, change that empowers the people. Quick note, in case you were wondering, we will not mandate implants of any kind, be it microchip, RFID, or nano tracking devices. We already cannot filter out pharmaceuticals from our drinking water. How much worse will it be if we have nano-sized transhuman waste infiltrating our drinking water, food chain, and local ecosystems? Continuing on to the supply side, we will be able to monitor the quantity and quality of goods and services that are being delivered from the extraction of elements or refinement of recycled elements to further processing on the production lines to the store shelf and to which retailers and service providers. Now, just as the Bitcoin cryptocurrency has a maximum amount of 21 million Bitcoins as the limiting factor to base its value off of, this resource-oriented economy will base its national and global currencies off of the measured amounts and efficiencies of our resources and its corresponding reserves. Perhaps to some degree, we may factor in estimates from the preliminary exploration of certain resources. Scientific evidence already confirms that pollution is destroying us and our posterity. Contaminants and byproducts are poisoning our sources of drinking water and are devastating every ecosystem in their path. Pollutants and particulates foul the very air we breathe and jeopardize the hundreds of millions who are living near the rising coastal waters. Obligated, our scientists and entrepreneurs are urged to advance the means and measures for us to monitor the impacts of producer and consumer waste that are supplied back onto the planet. This is what I call the resupply side of the new economy. Without this resupply side, we delude ourselves into thinking that our resources are forever abundant. Without this resupply side, we suffer at the hands of our own neglect. For when the fashion of ignorance is declared a fad, we lay naked in the pollution of our own consequences. Therefore, the RM will provide excellent compensation to those who produce goods and services that can be completely composted or recycled, having the lowest carbon footprint and pollution levels, and using the best practices for its community and the ecosystems they influence. Moreover, the Supply-Demand-Resupply, or SDR for short, inventory network will allow us to peer review the data and studies of various processes, which scientists can recommend best practices for sustainability and product performance that would affect the least amount of harm to other species and our ecosystems. As our technologies advance, we will be able to track and determine the cost-benefit analysis and actual life cycle of each product, from the ingredients that formulated it to its purchase and usage, then to its final resting place, cradle to grave. We will energize a culture of redesigning goods and services to become cradle to cradle, motivating us to mine landfills and perfect the reclamation process of waste. Our local markets exhibit fierce competition between mom and pop stores, big box retailers like Walmart, and online giants like Amazon. Jobs are threatened. Recently, I stopped in my local pet store and asked if they would honor the same discounted prices I could get online. The clerk, muscling away the worried look from her face, professionally excused herself to ask the manager. After a few minutes, she returned, confirming the discount and thanked me for coming in the store. Sure, I'd rather keep you guys in business, I replied, before heading down the aisle for supplies. I remember the look of relief on her face as she thanked me again. At the checkout, she confided in me that she had noticed a considerable slowdown in the foot traffic these past few months. You don't have to be an intuitive to know that people out there are uneasy. Most of us live paycheck to paycheck, taking some solace in the notion that if things fall apart, well, at least we have our life insurance. The super algorithm and the Internet of Things within the resource-oriented economy intuitively translates into an employment inventory and management grid, since the SDR inventory network transparently streamlines the supply-demand-resupply feedback loop. In local markets, this system will remedy ill effects of the zero-sum game between competing stores by sharing the inventory of goods and services and installing an aggressive cooperation compensation structure, such that an Amazon online order may be shipped from or picked up at the mom-and-pop store down the street or a nearby office depot on the way home from work. What's important is that we keep these mom-and-pop stores and medium-sized businesses alive and thriving, if not to maintain the employment levels in our communities, then to guard against the monopolies which will jack up their prices on cue once the competition closes its doors. Balancing the benefits of global trade and local markets are fundamental to our unity and growth. Fair trade can be more streamlined and efficient with a resource-oriented economy that is connected not just locally but globally. Similar to the Bank of International Settlements, our resources can be exchanged and transactions encrypted through a global SDR inventory network. As the demand for their goods and services increase, small business entrepreneurs, particularly in underdeveloped countries, will finally be able to scale up and access trade with the global markets, propelling their local communities to newer heights. In contrast with the obsolete system in place now, this feat will never be accomplished to its highest degree. Similar to the card game poker, wealthy nations with the largest stack of chips has the highest probability of winning or rigging the game to maintain their status quo. An eye-opening book for me was Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, which detailed some of the economic and military tactics used by the global elites to subjugate less developed nations as a newer version of colonialism. Part of globalization that manipulate to acquire foreign resources and implement predatory lending, labor, and trade practices against less developed nations, along with super subsidizing industries to price out the competition, are complicit acts of exploiting and enslaving our family of nations. One of the effects of such abusive foreign and economic policies on less developed nations is the fleeing of human capital. For instance, an argument can be made that NAFTA did more harm than good to Mexico and the 2 million Mexican farmers who had to leave their land since their crop prices dropped too low to support their families, and they did not have the lush government subsidies that the American farmers enjoyed. To escape poverty, many of these citizens became immigrants to countries having more opportunities for upwards mobility. And yes, sometimes their situation was so dire and imminent that having the proper documentation was a choice they didn't have, just as staying home and making a decent living was a choice they didn't have. In fact, it was the oppressive foreign policies, agents of greedy corporations, and corrupt government officials that made their choice for them. Unfortunately, in the United States, the innocent children of these immigrants who are accustomed to the American culture, language, and to the communities they participate in are now targets cited in the crosshairs of El Trump and his banda of Republicans. Outside the first plea for humanitarian compassion to obtain citizenship and the immorality of wrecking their home and American way of life, there is the conservative plea for securing our investments. We have already invested in these children's upbringing and education, and they are completely on course or ready, willing, and able to contribute in and benefit all aspects of American society, including caring for our seniors and fighting in our militaries. Using the madness of discrimination to waste the investment of a sure American success is so un-American. So, when someone stands on the pulpit and says, Americans are dreamers too, this within the confines of a zero-sum game economy, it's no wonder why we witness convulsions of protectionism and divisiveness. Similar to those jeering all lives matter, those responding with Americans are dreamers too may not have reconciled the full disclosure of economic exploitation nor their own family's immigrant story into their frenzy. In contrast, the revelation model will not blind you to those factors and will not wall out your heart, but instead will build the pillars to employ and provide for us all. So much so that citizens of less developed countries will no longer feel the sting of scarcity, nor face the ultimatum of leaving their family, friends, and country only to endure the perils of migration. What's the best immigration policy? I may be biased, but I say the more noble and just choice is to build the pillars of the revelation model and not spend $25 billion on a false sense of security that cannot completely wall people out, no more than it can wall out a rigged, compassionless, obsolete economic paradigm. Booyah! The revelation model will seek to end the revelation model will seek to end our divisiveness and to unify and transform our economy into a synergy sum game where 1 + 1 = 11 for all nations. As I continue to discuss the various pillars, you'll begin to see how private bank financing will not be necessary to free up the flow of resources and commerce. This may put an end to paying finance interest and may even cut out the current middlemen when it comes to raising our government's debt ceiling. Potentially, this SDR inventory network will make it easier to balance the budget, resulting in fewer threats to shut down the government. To prevent a centralized plutocracy, every citizen will then be able to vote on not only the scientific recommendations for sustainability, but on the algorithms that evaluate the currencies, its model of distribution, and more, effectively setting up the layer of a one-world government that's owned and operated by the people, purely for the benefit of the people. This layer of global governance will be directed to complement the national, state, and local layers of governance, not circumvent them. The details of this voting system will be discussed in future videos/articles. With the advantage of this public system, any person will be able to view the entire globe for production, consumption, and reclamation rates and figures of any specific item and service within each local market, each municipality. No FOIA form need be filed. The town may even decide to make transparent these supply-demand-resupply indicators for each subdivision or city block, again while providing complete anonymity per household and individual. Interestingly, there are already companies with the technology to glean our spending patterns, location, internet search histories, you name it, they probably have it. Under the current paradigm, these companies profit off of our individual habits and decisions. Unfortunately, we have a tendency to forfeit these assets once we click the I agree button after scrolling down the long list of legalese they call terms and conditions. Then all the cookies and tags latch on to every stroke of the computer keyboard and smartphone, siphoning away our metadata and selling them to the highest bidder. In Greg Palast's documentary, he investigated Karl Rove's voter database called I360 Data Trust, saying it hourly tracks over 1,800 data points, things about you, Mr. Voter, down to if you ordered Chinese food just before you voted. The marketing campaign these days are ferocious. In order to peruse through an online article, webpage, or email, you are greeted with a gauntlet of items you recently searched for. With all these floating ads and random pop-up banners to avoid, scrolling down to the bottom of the page becomes a test of one's nimble aptitude. Unlike the current economic system, the RM will rightfully transfer these metadata assets back to the individual. The RM will compensate us handsomely for our transparency, yet still allow us to control the varying degrees of privacy we decide to partake in. These data mining companies will then be converted to work for the people rather than the plutocrats. Sophisticated, the super algorithm and Internet of Things within this resource-oriented economy effectively is an employment inventory and management grid. Hence, if the elite were so enamored with automation, then let's take this automation to the job creation level using the revelation model, and then we'll see how these so-called job creators like it. To further elaborate, by having a more transparent system to audit our supply-demand-resupply loop, we can further optimize the utilization of our workforce. Whether an organization is owned privately, publicly, or otherwise, we can scale up or down facilities according to the thresholds and guidelines we collectively place when assessing the performances and demands of their goods and services. Industries can maintain specific production lines for consistent cyclical orders and modulate other production lines to meet the massive demands of unforeseen events. As I alluded to earlier, at the wake of hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, we are left with hundreds dead, damages affecting millions of people and over 100,000 businesses. Preliminary damage estimates for Hurricanes Harvey, according to the Ball State University analysis, could be up to $198 billion, and CNN Money reported an estimate of up to $95 billion for Hurricane Maria. Although the official cost of damage for the U.S. 2017 hurricane season are months away, the grand total may very well surpass $250 billion. On October 23, 2017, CNBC reported that the number of structures destroyed by the 245,000-acre Northern California wildfires climbed to 8,400. And that estimate may still rise, which again will cost us billions. Devastating pictures of the landscape in some of the aftermath were like glimpses of future scorched earth and doomsday scenarios. A reminder that no amount of nuclear taunting on the playground of politics can ever be justified. At least one would think. In the current model's response to natural disasters, rescue, relief, and rebuilding efforts seem to be stipend according to budgetary constraints and perhaps an area's political loyalty, as others have suggested. However, with the RM's resource-oriented economy, the raw demand will automatically allocate manpower, equipment, food, water, temporary and permanent shelters, etc., to fulfill all phases necessary to get our people back, not just on their feet, but hitting their strides toward success on the road to recovery. For another example, think back about 10 years ago to the collapse of the Minneapolis I-35 West Bridge. Prior to the collapse, the Indian Concrete Journal published an article that stated, in 1990, the federal government gave the I-35 West Bridge a rating of structurally deficient, citing significant corrosion in its bearings. Over 75,000 other U.S. bridges have this classification. 11 years later, another report noted, although fatigue cracking has not occurred in the deck truss, it has many poor fatigue details on the main truss and floor truss systems. Researchers from the University of Minnesota's Department of Civil Engineering continued on to conclude that the detailed fatigue assessment shows that fatigue cracking on the deck truss is not likely. Therefore, replacement of this bridge and the associated very high cost may be deferred. No time frame for deferment is mentioned. Then, 4 years later, the bridge was again rated as structurally deficient and in need of replacement, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation's National Bridge Inventory Database. The scale used was a sufficiency rating, which ranged from the highest score 100 to the lowest score 0. A score of below 80 indicates that some rehabilitation may be needed, while a score of 50 or less shows that replacement may be in order. The I-35 West Bridge was given a rating of 50 in the year 2005. Out of over 104,000 heavily used bridge structures, those with more than 10,000 vehicles traveling on them per day, only 4,227, or 4%, scored below 50, according to an analysis of federal records by MSNBC. Finally, on that dreadful rush hour evening of August the 1st, 2007, the bridge collapsed, plunging 13 people close to 100 feet to their death and injuring more than 100 others. Although warning signs were clear, the current system failed to protect those people. And although good and dedicated workers tried to prevent these tragedies, it's the system that remains structurally deficient. Had the revelation model been in place, it would have not prioritized the budget, and instead recognize the need and provide the appropriate resources to reinforce or replace the infrastructure. And this benefit would not end with roads. Facilities would stay maintained, as well as underground infrastructures like pipes for sewage and water. For instance, the governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder, commissioned the Flint Water Advisory Task Force, which issued its final report on March 2016. The following is an excerpt of the background summary and timeline of key events. On April 16, 2013, after a symbolic Flint City Council vote that accompanied the Flint Emergency Manager's decision, the city joined the Caragnandi Water Authority, KWA, which had been established to develop a raw water supply pipeline from Lake Huron. After being advised of the City of Flint's intent, Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, DWSD, notified the city of the termination of its then current water supply contract terms, effective April 2014. Although the state of Michigan was in control of both cities at the time, efforts to arrive at an agreement between the parties during the final year of service for the city of Flint ultimately failed. In April 2014, the city of Flint began treating Flint River water at the Flint Water Treatment Plant, WTP, on a full-time basis and distributing the treated water to its customers. A critical element of that treatment, corrosion control as required under EPA's lead and copper rule, LCR, was incorrectly determined by Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, MDEQ, not to be required immediately. Instead, Flint could complete 2 6-month monitoring periods, and the MDEQ would then determine whether corrosion control was necessary. Soon after the city began distributing treated water from the Flint water treatment plant, Flint residents began to complain about its odor, taste, and appearance. Numerous water quality problems and operational challenges resulted in water quality violations related to E. coli contamination and disinfection byproducts, total trihalomethanes or TTHMs. Ultimately, the corrosiveness of the drinking water leached lead from pipes and plumbing fixtures, and it may have increased the likelihood of water contamination with Legionella. On October 14, 2014, Valerie Brader, State Deputy Legal Counsel and Senior Policy Advisor, emails Governor's Chief of Staff Dennis Muchmore and other top aides arguing for a return to DWSD because of water quality problems. Michael Godola, then the governor's legal counsel, responds by agreeing with Brader. Brader and Rich Baird, another senior aide to the governor, then discussed the idea with the emergency manager Darnell Early, who maintains the water quality problems can be solved and it would be cost prohibitive to return to DWSD. The state-appointed emergency manager's cost prohibitive decision resumed for over a year. The report continues, on September 8, 2015, Virginia Tech posts to flintwaterstudy.org sample testing results on 252 samples of 300 sample kits provided. The Virginia Tech researchers concluded that, mathematically, even if the remaining 48 samples returned have non-detectable lead, Flint has a very serious lead in water problem. On September 24, 2015, Dr. Hannah Atisha presents her findings about children tested for lead in a press conference at Hurley Medical Center, reporting that the proportion of children with elevated blood lead levels has increased since the switch to the Flint River water source in April 2014. Prior to the switch, the number of cases of legionellosis in Genesee County had not exceeded 10 cases per year for several years. From June 2014 to October 2015, there were at least 87 cases of legionellosis in Genesee County with at least 9 deaths. This was described by an expert from the CDC in 2015 as one of the largest outbreaks of legionellosis in the past decade. On October 16, 2015, Flint switches back to DWSD as source of drinking water for the city. The unelected emergency manager's cost-prohibitive decision only demonstrates how this obsolete economy's cost of hubris prohibits the value of human life and liability. And contrary to what we'd like to believe, history and our current paradigm continue to prove that not all lives matter. The RM's resource-oriented economy would have never switched Flint's water source to begin with, because it would never ever seek to find the cheapest route, carrying the most risks to the planet and people's health. This brings up other advantages for the SDR inventory network. In order for the benefits of our new economy to remain boundless, a healthy workforce must be a prime directive. To improve the longevity of our workforce from prenatal to postmortem, healthcare, alternative medicine, dental care, child and senior care, even wellness and fitness centers will be free to the patient and customer. And as we incentivize our workforce to live healthier lifestyles, we ameliorate the risks of disability and early retirement associated with disease and disorders. Again, the more these pillars are revealed, the more you'll be able to imagine these probabilities. Similarly, we will optimize the appropriation of education, vocation training, license renewals, along with hiring programs to better utilize our workforce. In his documentary, economist Robert Reich said, "In the 3 decades after World War II, 1947 to 1977, not only did the economy boom in the United States, you had very low inequality, 13 to 9%. We made education a national priority, particularly higher education. A U.S. Census Bureau 2012 graph on higher education showed that by 1940, only 5.9% of adult Americans had a 4-year degree, but that percentage began to explode to roughly 24% by 1977. The GI Bill paid college costs for those returning from war, and the subsequent expansion of public universities made higher education affordable to many. By the late 50s, we had the best educated workforce of any country in the world. Countries that kept focusing on higher education were able to deal with globalization better by creating a highly skilled workforce. Look to South Korea, look at the Netherlands, look at Germany. They've invested substantially in education, in skill building of all of their workers. I'd concur, a well-informed citizenry is another supreme asset, and through the revelation model, all education programs will be free to all peoples, no matter what the demographics are or where you live, all around the world, from our first breath to our last. By using the SDR inventory network for a resource-oriented economy, not only will it solve the unemployment and underemployment problems we face, it promotes the restorative days of tomorrow with more certainty. One that allows you to stand alongside your boss with a more robust, streamlined information system and accurately determine the amount of orders your team needs to fill that day or week, thus enhancing our management of time. The RM will offer you more time and individual freedom to pursue your happiness than you have today. Should the work orders dip and your time free up, you can choose to spend that time however you see fit. You can choose to go home and be with your family or work on other projects, whether personal or business. You can exercise, sing and dance, relax, pursue a hobby, whatever your leisure. You can spend more time researching and staying updated to make better decisions and vote on political topics, community issues, and participatory budgeting. Or, if you're an ambitious workaholic, you can go to a second job, or you can study and train for a second job. With the revelation model, you may even study for a second job while working at your primary job, waiting for the business to pick up pace. This may all sound too good to be true, but it would make for a more flexible and well-trained workforce, ready to contribute to society's most needed demand. It makes even more sense knowing that the RM will sweeten the pot and reward your employer for allowing this, especially since the next pillar grants the revelation model the authority to pay employers, silent investors, shareholders, including all employees. In fact, the revelation model will pay everybody. Pillar 2, the people's power over money and credit, using public banks along with the universal single-payer system to compensate us all. September 17th, 2017 marked the 230th anniversary of the signing of the United States Constitution. May all the heavens and earth join us throughout the subsequent years to celebrate this monumental event in human history. Within our Constitution dwells a passage, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 5, granting our Congress the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Therefore, by referendum or by representation, we the people will exercise our authority to create, issue, and control the monetary and credit systems to be of the people, by the people, and for the people. Woohoo! Our legislative process can raise this pillar to support a more perfect union among our peoples. If you've ever thought that the creation and control of our entire money system should go back to the hands of the people, then you would be in the company of greatness. Father of the U.S. Constitution, President James Madison, proclaimed, "History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance." Founding Father President Thomas Jefferson declared, "I sincerely believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." In his autobiography, Founding Father Benjamin Franklin published, "The colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The inability of the colonists to get power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of George III and the international bankers was the prime reason for the Revolutionary War." President Abraham Lincoln stated, "The government should create, issue, and circulate all currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of its customers." The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, it is the government's greatest creative opportunity. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. In Bill Still's enlightening documentary, The Money Masters, the source of the above quotes, Bill narrates, "In the mid-1700s, pre-revolution America was still relatively poor. There was a severe shortage of precious metal coins to trade for goods, so the early colonists were forced to experiment with printing their own homegrown paper money. Colonial scrip was just paper money, debt-free money printed in the public interest and not backed by gold or silver coin. In other words, it was a total fiat currency. One day, officials at the Bank of England asked Franklin how he would account for the newfound prosperity of the colonies. Without hesitation, Benjamin Franklin replied, "In the colonies, we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to the demand of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money. We have no interest to pay no one." Begrudgingly, the British Crown stripped from American hands their colonial scrip, fertilizing the seeds of revolution. In yet another pivotal moment, the documentary explained, in 1861, Lincoln and his Secretary of Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, went to New York to apply for the necessary loan to win the Civil War. The money changers, anxious to see the Union fail, offered loans at 24 to 36% interest, which Lincoln denied. Lincoln sent for an old friend, Colonel Dick Taylor of Chicago, and assigned him to find solutions for financing the war. Lincoln asked Taylor what he discovered. Taylor put it this way: "Just get Congress to pass a bill authorizing the printing of full legal tender treasury notes, and pay your soldiers with them, and go ahead and win your war with them also." Colonel Dick Taylor continued, "The people or anyone else will not have any choice in the matter if you make them full legal tender. They will have the full sanction of the government and be just as good as any money, as Congress is given the expressed right by the Constitution." In 1862 through 1863, he printed $450 million at no interest to the federal government worth of new bills. In order to distinguish them from the other banknotes in circulation, he printed them in green ink on the back side. That's why the notes were called greenbacks. Bill quoted historian W. Cleon Skousen saying, right after the Civil War, there was considerable talk about reviving Lincoln's brief experiment with a constitutional monetary system. Had not the European money trusts intervened, it would have no doubt become an established institution. Bill continued, the money changers wanted two things: the reinstitution of a central bank under their exclusive control and an American currency backed by gold. Their strategy was twofold. First of all, cause a series of panics to try to convince the American people only centralized control of the money supply could provide economic stability. And secondly, remove so much money from the system that most Americans would be so desperately poor that they either wouldn't care or would be too weak to oppose the bankers. The film displayed a table regarding the amount of money in circulation during certain time periods. The table, entitled Post-Civil War Depression, showed in the year 1866 there was a total of $1.8 billion. That's $50.46 per capita. In the year 1886, there was a total of $400 million. That's $6.67 per capita. In those 20 short years, the banks removed roughly $1.4 billion from circulation and dramatically reduced the people's livelihood by $43.79 per capita. And back in those days, a dollar would have bought a whole lot more bread than today. Midway through those years, in 1877, the panic quickly turned into riots from Pittsburgh to Chicago. The documentary admitted, today, economists try to sell the idea that recessions and depressions are a natural part of something they call the business cycle. The truth is, our money supply is manipulated now just as it was before and after the Civil War. How did money become so scarce? Simple. Bank loans were called in and no new ones were given. In addition, silver coins were melted down. As the documentary noted, they began a periodic fleecing of the flock, as they called it, by creating economic booms and followed by further depressions, so they could buy up thousands of homes and farms for pennies on the dollar. An excerpt of an 1891 document from the American Bankers Association, as printed in the Congressional Record of April 29, 1913, exposed a planned recession 3 years in advance, which stated, on September the 1st, 1894, we will not renew our loans under any consideration. On September 1st, we will demand our money. We will foreclose and become mortgagees in possession. We will take 2/3 of the farms west of the Mississippi and thousands of them east of the Mississippi as well, at our own price. Then the farmers will become tenants, as in England. The banks countered the Lincoln greenback's lure of making a comeback by repeatedly contracting the money supply. Today, over 100 years later, a more complex crisis is laying siege upon us at all levels of government, especially the individual states. For instance, prior to the Illinois legislators' vote last July, WGN News, a local Chicago newscast, interviewed financial expert Terry Savage, referring to the Wall Street Journal's article, Illinois Sinks. Terry claimed that Illinois has $14.6 billion in unpaid bills, $250 billion in unfunded pensions debt, $1.6 billion in higher education cuts, already professors may be leaving, and $2.3 billion of road projects in jeopardy. 20,000 jobs were on the balance. Terry Savage said, people are leaving this state. More people had left Illinois than any other state for the 3rd year in a row. Our growth is slowing. We have a slower growth than all of the surrounding states except Iowa, and we're tied with them. Illinois is obligated to cut spending, raise taxes, or default on its promises. I suppose if Rauner thinks that taking an oath as governor excuses him to a $15 billion bill backlog, to jeopardize Illinois into having a junk bond status, to adding $800 million of late payment interest penalties, according to Illinois Comptroller Susana Mendoza, then he may prove to be another leader who walks the fine line between arrogance and negligence. Fortunately, the Illinois General Assembly did amass enough bipartisan votes to override Governor Rauner's vetoes and pass a balanced budget. By the estimate of State Senator Linda Holmes, that balanced budget dropped the bill backlog by up to $8 billion. Had the legislature not passed the budget, the bill backlog would have ballooned to $28 billion by the end of Rauner's term. I'm not sure the good voters who backed Rauner expected his business acumen to culminate into playing chicken with a General Assembly to bankrupt Illinois. What's particularly troubling is that Illinois is not the only state in the red. With little research, you'll find that most states, and nations for that matter, are sinking more times than they are swimming. As previously mentioned, the internet is saturated with predictions of the next economic collapse, having a laundry list of complex potential triggers: quantitative easing blowback, underfunded pensions, retail store closures and dismal sales across numerous industries, tsunamis of underemployment, declining tax revenues from the wealthy and underemployed, budget deficits at the state, federal, and municipal levels, government ceiling debt crisis, trade deficits, skyrocketing household, student, and commercial debts, housing bubble relapse, market manipulation, national healthcare crisis, infrastructure failures, polarized politics leading to potential government shutdowns, currency devaluation and impending hyperinflation, overtaxing the middle and low-income classes while undercutting their buying power, government spending cuts and hyper-austerity, privatizing government assets, talks of secession, wars and rumors of wars, so on and so forth. With all this propaganda of self-induced pandemonium, it's as if we're beginning the birth pangs of a new economic paradigm. Before I get into the details of the Revelation model's second pillar, let's go through a brief rundown of the obsolete system we currently inherit. The U.S. Treasury Department creates and sells bonds to centralized private banks, the Fed, in exchange for money to pay for expenses on the federal budget which our tax revenues alone could not completely cover. These bonds, however, are purchased with money the centralized private banks create out of thin air by simply typing it into their computer. Why pay back the interest on the bond when we could have issued the currency interest-free? As the iconic Thomas Edison postulated, it is absurd to say that our country can issue $30 million in bonds and not $30 million in currency. Both are promises to pay, but one promise fattens the usurers and the other helps the people. The debt is exacerbated by the compound effects of fractional reserve banking. Private banks don't loan out all their cash at hand. Depending on the reserve requirement, they loan out 10 or more times the money they actually have in their vault or they have deposited in the Federal Reserve Bank. The private banks do this by considering its customers' deposits as loanable amounts. The banks pool the amount of deposits together and, as financial intermediaries, are supposed to practice prudent lending, perhaps rewarding you with some of that whopping interest you see in your savings deposit today. The process feeds into itself so that deposit money snowballs into more loanable debt, which snowballs into more deposit money, which snowballs into a bigger debt, and so on and so forth. When the bank issues loans, they clear these applications with the underwriting of the day. Type it into their computer, then abracadabra, money is created. It's no wonder why the shrewd banking founder of the House of Rothschild, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, confessed, Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws. Private, public, or otherwise, all this debt adds up until we all wake up one day, tens of trillions of dollars in debt later. Polarized, we find ourselves at each other's throat, arguing about how to divvy up the bill, steeped in waist-high polluted waters which are rising by the day. This current system is an experiment that has run its course. All things considered, it gave us the best it could under the culture that ruled over it, and left us with a mixed bag of unresolved issues and emotions. The current experiment gave us advancements, both positive and negative. And now it's time for the people to grab the baton and run with a new system, a novel paradigm subject to the will of the people. Make no mistake, if we do not explore the creation of our new economy, the establishment will fill the void with their next rigged financial system, hand-tailored to garb and girdle their status quo. Who knows what the new merry-go-round of madness will look like? Maybe they'll revoke our ability to take cash out of our own accounts, preventing any potential run on the banks. Maybe they'll issue a mandate for us to turn in all of our cash and precious metals as President FDR did with gold. Maybe they'll push negative interest rates, add and bump up other fees, so we pay them for holding our hard-earned money hostage. Maybe they'll launch FedCoin, or the Fed's version of Bitcoin, giving them the illusion of a sleek new monetary system. Maybe they'll combo all of this and concede to universal basic income only as a contrivance to remain sitting in the seat of power. If we go back to the gold standard, then beware the golden rule. He who has the most gold rules. Haven't we already been there, done that? Should gold resume the object of man, then we condemn ourselves to relive centuries of transgression and war, idolizing a failed game. Making matters worse, the manipulation of gold has already spilled over from physical to digital. In December 2016, Reuters reported Deutsche Bank agreed to pay a mere $60 million to settle in a U.S. gold price-fixing case. Not claiming responsibility, of course. Investors sued Deutsche Bank, Barclays plc, Bank of Nova Scotia, HSBC Holdings plc, and Societe Generale in 2014, claiming that they conspired to fix gold prices from 2004 to 2013. In early June of last year, the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, filed and settled charges against former trader David Liu for engaging in numerous acts of spoofing and manipulating the gold and silver futures market. The CFTC stated that Liu coordinated this trading with another precious metals trader at another large financial institution. The intent of triggering the customer stop-loss orders was to allow the traders to buy precious metals futures contracts at artificially low prices or sell precious metals futures contracts at artificially high prices. These market manipulations occurred during the time former Congressman Ron Paul was mocked for attempting to pass a bill that would completely audit and assay the gold in Fort Knox, giving assurance to the people that all the gold was still there. CNN Money reported in June 2011 that the Treasury Department and Government Accountability Office audits the gold based on sample sizes, not the complete lot as then Congressman Ron Paul adhered to. Albert Einstein said it best, "You cannot solve the problems of the world with the same thinking that created it." Ergo, the Revelation model will open publicly owned and operated banks to exercise our authority to create, issue, and control the monetary and credit systems. Although it's not required, we will provide the option for private banks to convert into public banks. This great transition will certainly honor the bank's right to remain private, but they must follow the same regulations as the public banks, or else it'll be deemed as non-compliant and will be paid far less or deemed as insolvent and will undergo procedures similar to the protocols of insolvency used today. Economics professor and longtime advocate of public banks, Richard Wolff, often refers to North Dakota's thriving public state bank called the Bank of North Dakota. Launched almost 100 years ago in 1919, Mr. Wolff stated that those who promoted the bank wanted the money that flowed into the state, county, and city governments of North Dakota to be deposited in the people's banks. Any interest earned on that should be folded back into the coffers of the state to help the state do the things it does for its people. And moreover, the state should favor North Dakotans who need money for their personal needs, for their small businesses, and so on. Since their profits don't go to the hands of private shareholders, in 2011, there were enough profits to rebate $70 million to the state of North Dakota, which could go towards the needs of their residents or lower their taxes. Number 2, Mr. Wolff continued, the bank pays very low salaries relative to what other bankers get. For example, the top 2 officials of the Bank of North Dakota get $232,000 a year and $135,000 a year. They are paid as public employees. Last point, as a public bank, it has a different bottom line. It doesn't maximize profit for shareholders. For example, an interesting program it has long had is a partnership in assisting community expansion, quoting the bank, to provide loans at below market interest rate to businesses if and only if those businesses create at least one job every $100,000 loan made to them. Wow, a bank that links its loans to job creation in a conservative state, no less. Isn't it interesting that they hold on to their public, not private bank? There's a lesson there somewhere. There are 20 other states with some kind of legislation planned to possibly go in that direction and establish state banks. Since Mr. Wolff's statement, we can include to this growing list of public bank sanctuaries Washington, D.C. and the city of Los Angeles. Mother Jones published an article in March 2017 reporting that officials in Philadelphia and Oakland, California are taking a hard look at the idea, and Santa Fe, New Mexico has done a feasibility study that concluded a city-run bank would benefit the community socially and economically. If done right, the report found the bank would create a robust local lending climate and bring in millions of dollars per year in revenue. The article went on to say that there are already successful public banks in France, Germany, Japan, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. Moreover, from 1910 to 1966, U.S. post offices operated as de facto public banks, where people could deposit and borrow small sums. Public banks have been around for over 100 years and has proven worthy of expansion, which the revelation model will ratify. In addition, the RM will aim to employ the best practices for newer currency systems and technologies. As I alluded to earlier, it may be possible for the revelation model to use a cryptocurrency much like Bitcoin's blockchain technology as a public ledger system, backed by the SDR inventory network of a nation's resource-oriented economy. That statement is so important that it does bear repeating, since pegging a nation's currency to the stability of the quantity and quality valuations of its resources may quell the forces of hyperinflation, perhaps in time replacing the GDP and GNP entirely. Of course, this will be tested side by side to our current economy for decades, maybe longer, before a nation's people would be confident enough to bring its activation to a vote, thereby backing up that currency to the full faith and credit of that nation's people. Again, one of the purposes of the RM is to pursue an economic system that can verifiably be of the people, by the people, and for the people, that we can validate any possible influence and negative impact on that system due to the invisible hand of the private banks, the corporatocracy, or any dark, sinister force we have yet to encounter. The blockchain technology would offer an interesting method to do exactly that, to both secure individual privacy on one hand and accurately audit transactions on the other. We will also implement layers of backup systems which the cyber community can chime in on. We will be able to discuss these matters, put it to a vote, and implement them on the testing models that we will develop. Another goal for the RM is to reform aspects of the current system proven to be ongoing sources of failures, entry points, and loopholes where laws and business practices can easily cross the line onto unfettered greed. Traditionally, interest rates pay lenders and return on investment ROI rates pay investors for a potential loss of capital they would have otherwise used on other investment opportunities. Yet, in hindsight, we've experienced the growth of income and equity mainly as a function of abusing the growth of interest via debt, or abusing the growth from profit via unethical business practices. Rather than continuing to bury ourselves under a mountain of interest, debt, and the spoils of exploitation, the revelation model will convert interest and return on investment rates to instead prioritize the continual growth rate in the quality of life. This ultimately puts an end to the fantasy of a continual growth of income via the continual growth of debt. To support our liberation from debt, all banks will issue loans at 0% interest. No more lending to others at prime interest rates, no above prime, and no secondary interest rates. By implementing and controlling the process of peer-reviewed best practices, the risk and cost of opportunity, the primary reason behind interest rates, will approach zero as our standards of living and technology ascend higher and higher. If we want to assure that our demands for political change become tangible, we as a collective must exact our political will far beyond the follow-through. We cannot just elect our leaders and be done with it, as we know all too well the agonies of apathy. Remember, it was the Republican President Lincoln who urged Congress to pass a bill issuing greenbacks. How fitting would it be for another Republican president to urge Congress to pass a bill issuing the currency necessary to explore the pillars described in the revelation model, and at the very least reforming our campaign finance system? Or will the Democrats or another political party initiate and lead to align the interests of the people with the integrity of a fair system for distributing wealth and compensation? Will they pursue the pillars of this framework for the people, or will they box us out and let the corporatocracy fill the void with their next OS, operating system, or oppressive system, version 666? Who among our leaders will be the champion of the people? To whoever pursues any public office, let their endorsement of the revelation model be the measure of their honesty. No longer will the private banks wield the power over money, defeating the terror of keeping us on the hook. Instead, we will transfer the reins of this power over money onto the people. We will navigate this transition in a responsible way. The promise to pay our debts, particularly to government bondholders, will be restructured to reaffirm an ancient covenant, one that supersedes any and all hierarchy of creditors. A covenant exists divinely encoded in our DNA to secure the posterity and prosperity of our entire human race. This great transition will be done compassionately, holding society's promise to take care of one another by allowing people to keep and maintain their homes, cars, and to provide healthcare, education, training, and job placement, especially to those of industries most in need of our mercy. If you are an employee of an organization that will undergo the most retraining, such as private banks, rest assured, as you'll have the freedom to stay in your current private bank or transfer over to a publicly owned bank, or transition your work schedule to receive free education, training, and job placement into a different field altogether. Remember, with the public supply, demand, resupply inventory network, we can compensate the supply side to pick up these newly trained workers. This will be done with no loss of income, as the items you've traditionally purchased every month to maintain your current lifestyle and household, including allowances for repairs, replacements, and handling accidental and emergency situations, will have been registered into the public SDR inventory network and guarantees you will continue to receive them. You are already witnessing a similar trend for online stores to auto-charge recurring orders. Amazon has offered deeper discounts on items you select as automatic reorders, some on a monthly basis. Big box stores like PetSmart and others have offered free shipping and further discounts for the same type of automatic reorders. This burgeoning trend, when applied through the Revelation model, will be more robust to encompass all of your needs. These goods and services will always be due to you month after month as you undergo the transformation of retraining and job placement. As always, you will have the choice to change items, request additional quantities, postpone deliveries, all the liberties you have today. This great transition extends to all peoples all across the globe, to all sectors of the economy, whether your organization is private, public, NGO, charitable, religious, or otherwise. This is what the Revelation model considers to be a compassionate transition in restructuring the payoff of debt, a promise it will keep as a socially divine covenant. Now, as the title of this second pillar suggests, the Universal Single Payer USP system will pay everything and everyone. By having the authority to control money via public banks, manage our resources via the SDR inventory network, and distribute them through a model I will explain in a future video, the Universal Single Payer will fairly and democratically compensate us all. The idea of a single payer system is already gaining ground in the healthcare industry. It's only a matter of time before people awaken and expand this notion to encompass the entire economic universe, inclusive to all entities, private, public, and otherwise. More than 1,000 physicians were surveyed last year by the Chicago Medical Society. It concluded that 66.8% have a generally favorable view of a single-payer financial healthcare system. According to a June 2017 YouGov poll, 44% of all Americans favor a single-payer healthcare system, well above the 31% who oppose it. Around the same time, another national survey conducted by the Pew Research Center claimed 60% say the federal government is responsible for ensuring healthcare coverage for all Americans. Among the 60%, more now say it should be provided through a single health insurance system run by the government. Among Democrats, 52% now say health insurance should be provided through a single national insurance system run by the government. It's no secret, I agree with Senator Bernie Sanders, a longtime proponent of the single payer and infamous political rock star, who has proclaimed, "Healthcare is a right, not a privilege." The deaf Senator Elizabeth Warren, that was pretty good. The deaf Senator Elizabeth Warren, in a June 2017 interview with the Wall Street Journal, has admitted, now it's time for the next step, and the next step is single payer. The dynamo from Hawaii, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, also supports universal health care, aka Medicare for all. Indeed, more and more people are pushing for a single-payer healthcare system for all Americans, and rightfully so. Surprisingly, I was quite encouraged as this Pew Research report continued. Most Republicans, 57%, say the government should continue programs like Medicare and Medicaid for seniors and the very poor. Just a meager 9% of Republicans say the government should not be involved in providing health insurance for all. This positive shift in the public sentiment to welcome the single payer, however, is not without pushback. Those who have reservations, unsurprisingly, are afraid that we will ration out the medical care and end up waiting in long lines. The funds are drying up, so they think we're forced to concentrate our resources on keeping Medicare alive only for seniors. Under the current obsolete economic system alone, then certainly these concerns are not without merit. Ergo, I believe the solution must entail more than singing the typical Democratic song of cutting the military budget and hiking up taxes on the rich. To accomplish our objectives for healthcare, education, job creation, and the distribution of wealth. Ultimately, the solution must reside in ascending the global culture and structure of our economic and political systems. Obviously, the revelation model breaks the mold of our now obsolete economic paradigm. So going back, it would be interesting to know how many Republicans and Libertarians would agree to a universal health care if its budget would have all green lights facing it. So much so that we will build more clinics, update more hospitals, hire more healthcare professionals, and dispense the needed medicine, therapy, equipment, and treatments to erase any doubts of rationing our medical care or standing in long lines. The revelation model will denounce any disposition where the constraint of money imprisons the generosity and ingenuity of men and women. Let's claim victory over our ailments as we all restructure the economy together, using the pillars of the revelation model in a responsible, feasible way. So if most Americans want to go single payer, then wait till they get a load of this. I predict when the universal single payer comes into fruition, there will be dancing on the streets for weeks on end. I say this with great confidence because I know the RM will finally correct one of the major criticisms we hold against our current model. That is the flaccid responses towards the various shapes and depth of abject corruption. The ongoing nonsense of our obsolete model turns a blind eye towards corruption in virtually every aspect of our economy. In contrast, because the universal single payer may use a blockchain-inspired technology, it will audit every single account and reform the entire global banking network. This checks and balance system will be intrinsic to the universal single payer, and it will mitigate, if not eliminate, the forces of corruption. Think about all the possible accounts of financial institutions that harbor not only the profits of tax evaders, but also the covert coffers of terrorism. All the talk about dark money, potentially undocumentable money that should have been appropriated through normal government channels. These profits of drug and human trafficking criminals, black market accounts, transactions of corrupted dictators from numerous countries. The list goes on and on. Perhaps unwittingly, some private banks appear to have been laundering the profits of evil deeds from time immemorial. When the universal single payer lifts this boulder of exploitation, who knows what will crawl out from under it? The universal single payer will then use its collective wisdom and stretch out the hand of clemency in exchange for full disclosure. Obviously, we will all have to discuss and deliberate on the details of this framework, but we will only endorse a democratic process. Should the process contain even the slightest hint of being governed by corporations, plutocrats, and oligarchs, then it is not the revelation model, and we will oppose any policy subjugating us to the interests and profits of the wicked few. Not only will private bankers bend the knee, but all politicians will reform their campaign financing through this revelation model. We will urge the Supreme Court to overturn Citizens United. We will finance all political campaigns and discuss the terms of regulating the access, quantity, and quality of all campaign marketing communications using the universal single payer system. For example, through an independent peer-reviewed process, we may label political advertisements as baseless opinions, or opinions based on skewed data, or opinions based on balanced data, or opinions based on partially verified data, and so on and so forth. Of course, the more verified and balanced the information, the higher the compensation and the more accessible the information will be for public view. At the very least, we need to place some daylight between these communications to make some distinctions and better assess our due diligence in this era of easy fake news. Furthermore, just as we pay our energy supply source independently from our energy infrastructure, as seen on our ComEd bill, our journalists will be regarded as independent contractors for the public source of information. Thus, our journalists will be paid higher to report more relevant, verified, and balanced news, even if these reports doesn't show their parent companies, affiliates, and advertisers in their best light. And because the universal single payer will compensate both employers and employees independently, it will mitigate, if not eliminate, most tactics of the zero-sum game where employers must battle unions and employees for wages, benefits, number of work hours, vacation pay, and maternal leave. Or other social issues like cutting more taxes for the ultra-rich versus burdening more general taxes on middle and low-income communities. That being said, these companies have no cause for alarm, as they will have ample time to transition to reform their standard operating procedures, practices, and corporate culture to come out on top once we decide to activate this new economic system. Musicians, actors, and artists who lost money because of the internet will be able to restructure the monetization format to receive capital through the universal single payer. On the same token, video bloggers who are hurting from YouTube's demonetization campaign and other social media entrepreneurs enduring hardships and limitations can lick their wounds, as they'll be compensated well via the universal single payer. By owning and controlling the monetary system, we can incubate nonprofit orgs and small businesses whose missions are aligned with civil rights, consumer advocacy, and social justice. They can all rest easy, as they will witness their programs provide the opportunities for low-income families to move up and improve their quality of life, whether they live in the boondocks of a red state or the ghettos of a blue city. Scientists will enjoy robust compensation rates for their accurate, peer-reviewed studies. We will engineer a world where intentionally rigging or cooking the books of scientific experiments will not be tolerated, and where suppressing pertinent information from the well-being of mankind will be severely penalized. In the upper echelon of government bureaucracies, any person who has ever worked for a major for-profit corporation will not be allowed to take any office, nor be eligible to become a voting board member of any regulatory agency. Of course, they will be allowed to counsel any agency, but again, will not have the authority to vote. These restrictions are needed to rectify the corruptive influences within our current culture, but may be lifted when corporations have had decades demonstrating their performances in complete alignment with the welfare of the people. This is to assure the best interests of denizens the world over, especially within crucial agencies such as the departments of the Treasury, State, Defense, Homeland Security, Justice, Education, Labor, Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, Energy, Agriculture, Interior, the FDA, EPA, CDC, FCC, SEC, yeah, just to name a few. Contrary to the hot mess we have today, the survival and efficacy of any future governing agency will never rely on the money of those they must regulate, nor will they take orders from the industry they are charged to oversee. To do so would be a conflict of interest. Unfortunately, this foundation stone of integrity is severely lacking in the White House, and has been so for some time. Prior to his inauguration, Donald Trump backpedaled from his "Draining the Swamp" campaign slogan. During his thank you tour in Des Moines, Iowa, he confessed, "Funny how that term, draining the swamp, caught on. I hated it. That's so hokey. That's so terrible. I said, all right, I'll try it. Then I started saying it like I meant it, right?" As if to confess his infidelity. He then proceeded to explain that he would impose a 5-year ban on executive branch officials becoming lobbyists. But what he failed to mention was that lobbyists take their marching orders from the industries they represent, and they could still become board members, consultants, or whatever position furthering the endeavors of these industries, just not registered lobbyists. This softened stance seemed to telegraph his need to cushion the blows from a flurry of announcements regarding his quasi-establishment appointees. Indeed, he jumped over the lobbyists and appointed board members of companies like Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, or Steven Mnuchin, previously an executive officer of Goldman Sachs, and prior to heading the Department of Energy, Rick Perry resigned as a board member of Energy Transfer Partners, the company slated to build the Dakota Access Pipeline. These are just some names of what has been called the richest White House cabinet and advisory staff in history, having a net worth of more than $63 billion, estimated by the watchdog activist group hedgeclippers.org. Trump could not have forged a better cabinet of controlled opposition than the establishment themselves. He may have had limited experience in political office prior to his inauguration, but a true outsider would not gravitate towards decisions that would further the gains of the establishment. For those who still believe Trump tells it like it is, why is his battle cry not "Make America's rich get richer"? But that's no different than Mitt Romney's 47% debacle, and Trump hates losers. So maybe at any given moment, he just tells you what you want to hear. Or maybe at any given moment, he just tells you what you want to hear. In addition to appointing safety nets for the status quo, Trump uses another tactic straight out of the establishment's playbook: divide and conquer. More than just pitting us against each other with his dog whistles of law and order for minorities and immigrants, or his sensibilities for pardoning white supremacists, or prolonging failed ideologies of deregulation and detaxation to appease the corporatocracy, Using his fake news hammer, Trump has been pounding Orwellian values to confuse the masses. Any legitimate question the media presses him on, Trump casts doubt, swinging his hammer with accusations of being fake news. If he suggests we can't trust anyone, independent journalists, peer reviewed scientific reports, and the likes, other than whatever he has to say, then this is no different than Big Brother brainwashing us with posters insisting that ignorance is strength. Let's make doubly sure the other two Orwellian virtues, war is peace and freedom is slavery, will never settle into our reality. Accomplishing this would best be done by the will of the people, diligently collaborating to save mankind and ascend the masses to a higher level of humanity. Enforcing our demands will take grassroots effort, networking, organizing, assembling, canvassing, contacting community and government leaders, and of course, protesting against the decisions of our leaders and agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. Trump's FCC, which I affectionately refer to as Trump's Ministry of Truth, is a peculiar air of poison to democracy, in that its odorless danger stretches further than any border and subtly possesses the deepest roots of our darkest prejudices. The PBS NewsHour aired an enlightening report in October 2017, which involved the Sinclair Broadcast Group, one of the largest owners of local TV stations, reaching over a third of American homes. The report said that must-run, strongly conservative commentary clips of Boris Epshteyn, former Trump administration member and now chief political analyst for Sinclair, and weekly segments of the Terrorism Alert Desk are now mandated to air on all 173 Sinclair stations. In some cases, stations have to run them as often as 9 times a week, claimed the PBS journalist William Brangham. Continuing on, he said, this partisan tilt has many free speech advocates alarmed, because not only does Sinclair own such a large chunk of the marketplace already, but it's hoping to get bigger still. If a proposed $4 billion merger with Tribune Media goes forward, Sinclair would now reach 3 out of 4 American households. Television remains the main source of news for many Americans. In 2016, 46% of adults say they get their news from local TV stations, and it's information they can trust. 41% of registered voters said they trust local news to tell the truth, while just 27% trust national news, according to the Pew Research Center. Sinclair even caught the eye of HBO's John Oliver, who poked fun at how Sinclair sometimes forces conservative talking points onto the scripts of their local news anchors read. Then he showed video clips of different anchors echoing the same phrases verbatim. Traditionally, to protect against any one company becoming too dominant, Congress has set certain caps on how many media outlets any one corporation can own in a given market. But the FCC recently changed those rules. Under the new leadership of Trump's appointee, Ajit Pai, the FCC has now made it easier to approve Sinclair's expansion. Tom Wheeler is the former chair of the FCC. He thinks these new changes are a blow to a free and vibrant press. When addressing the Harvard Kennedy School, Wheeler said the Trump FCC has, in one very short period, moved to change 3 basic rules that have been in place to protect the diversity of voices and avoid monopolization of the broadcast television market. We have a society in which the flow of information is crucial to a democracy, and when that free flow of information gets choked off by corporate consolidation, we ought to all worry. PBS also said Eric Lipton of the New York Times discovered meetings and correspondence between Ajit Pai and Sinclair executives that he says raises questions about the company's influence with the Trump administration. Lipton was recorded saying he, Pai, met with the executive officers of Sinclair just a few days before Trump was inaugurated, where they made it clear to him that they were looking for the Trump administration to roll back some of these restrictions that were essentially limiting their ability to get bigger. And it was just a matter of a couple of weeks when all of a sudden Pai was named chairman, and he was actually rolling back the same rules that they had approached him on. And only as a result of rolling back these rules is Sinclair merger going to be able to go through. People, please contact the FCC, the Oval Office, and your senators and representatives right away. Voice your opinion on this matter. If by chance bureaucratically approved, fear-induced political brainwashing doesn't light a flame under your bum, then what will? Taking away the internet as you now know it? Because that is exactly what Trump's FCC chairman is also planning to do. Fast Company interviewed Tom Wheeler in July 2017. The article explained that in order to impose the net neutrality safeguards which prevent ISPs from blocking, slowing, or delivering some internet traffic faster than others, a federal court said Wheeler's FCC would have to reclassify ISPs as common carriers under Title II of the 1934 Telecommunications Act. So it did, much to the displeasure of the ISPs. It paraphrased Wheeler saying the Trump FCC is simply doing the bidding of Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, and Charter. Soon after the corporate attorney Ajit Pai approved the removal of these Title II protections, I imagined a vicious cycle of discrimination infecting all parties. ISPs discriminating against websites and content by charging more money or lowering their priority. Then websites, in some manner, having to pass those costs on to its customers, visitors, and subscribers by charging subscription fees. Then internet users having to lay down their list of demands and scrutinizing against internet service providers and websites. By the way, on a lighter note, who else found it a disappointing discovery that watching Star Trek meant paying this cover charge? Unless we banish Pai's obsession into a black hole, the troubling trend of subscription fees may cling on indefinitely. With the FCC's actions, words, and phrases set on stun, I hope and pray Trump supporters will use warp speed when they turn and run. Bringing some balance. Gotta all right. Gotta make it fun sometimes, you know. All right, all jokes aside, bringing some balance into this narrative, last year, Chairman Pai did sit down with a PBS NewsHour journalist, William Brangham, and explained his motivation to roll back the Title II net neutrality protections. Pai stated, "My concern is that by imposing those heavy-handed economic regulations on internet service providers, big and small, we could end up disincentivizing companies from wanting to build out internet access to a lot of parts of the country, low-income urban and rural areas, for example. What we're trying to do going forward is figure out a way that we can preserve the free and open internet that customers want and need, and preserve that incentive to invest in a network that will ultimately benefit even more consumers going forward." However, former FCC Chairman Wheeler had a rebuttal to Pai's answer, saying, "So let's go to what the ISPs tell their financial regulator. You know, there is an important thing that the ISPs have, a lobbying message at the FCC and the Congress that is designed to accomplish their goals of giving them free rein. But then over at the SEC, they are under penalty of law required to tell the truth. How does what they say in their financial filings differ from what they say at the FCC? Well, in their financial filings, they say they are spending a constant amount. They say they are spending about 15% of revenue on infrastructure investment. Later, Comcast had their quarterly report and reaffirmed they are spending 15% of revenue on building infrastructure. So, if this is the best thing the Trump FCC can come up with, the impact on infrastructure argument, then they are playing a pretty weak hand. If deception is a dog-eared page in the establishment's playbook, then why aren't we spotting them sooner or calling them out on it? To me, the unfortunate truth are that legions of voters may be using this dismal economy and corporatocracy culture to rationalize discrimination, to carelessly perpetuate the socioeconomic supremacy complexes that has ravaged the histories of countless nations. They may be telling themselves that a downward budget justifies a darkened bias against people who appear different accents and language, different skin tones and facial features, a different tradition, belief, and ethnicity, different abilities, age, gender, and tendencies for intimacy. They may boastfully wield tiki torches, parading about strapped in body armor, and from the spittle off their tongue waves the banner of hate from a bygone era, or at least some thought so. They may be like the Georgian police lieutenant attempting to soothe the nerves of a fearful white motorist he had just stopped by saying, "But you're not black. Remember, we only kill black people," subtly conditioning perhaps the notion that all lives are supposed to matter. They may hold NRA cards and recklessly stand their ground claiming, "The shadow government's taken over. We can't possibly regulate our child-killing AR-15s. They may be like the Nicholas Cruzes and post a YouTube comment stating, "I'm going to be a professional school killer." They may be like the Nicholas Cruzes and post a YouTube comment stating, "I'm going to be a professional school killer." For those who find themselves feeling trapped, for those who find themselves feeling trapped in this pit of despair, I ask you, if you take away this economic rationale, this God-forsaken culture we've duped ourselves into holding on, and instead turn it around. Take ownership and control of the money and political systems. Sorry. Will you then open yourself up to accept less spoken truths in the wisdom of Scripture? Will you then open yourself up to accept less spoken truths in the wisdom of Scripture? God said that each of us are perfect as we are, yet Where's the sermon glorifying this perfection through our diversity? God said his plan is perfect. Yet where's the sermon saying it is perfect when we collaborate and celebrate in this diversity? Let's not wait any longer, and let's be that walking embodiment and action of these sermons. As the good book points out, when we are all in agreement is when God's presence feels stronger in our midst. For us to get there on that mountaintop, as Dr. King so eloquently referred to, for all of us to come together in agreement, we absolutely need stronger provisions of transparency and net neutrality. Keep in mind, normal business cycle or not, when the next economic collapse arrives, the establishment will stifle the internet and the people's ability to organize against them. If the president leaves pie at the helm, they can slow down and shutter all things in the best interest of our middle and low-income communities. They can block out the information and tools that conflict with the plutocracy's interests, or effectively block out our data. Loading, timed out. Loading, timed out. The FCC's ruling will allow the elite to throttle up fast lanes and promote their problem reaction solution. Yet another economic perversion, a regurgitation of the same rigged corporatocracy game. Bottom line, regardless of any party affiliation, the one common ground all Americans must gather and stand together on is our right to keep the internet neutral. So if you hate the TPP and the corporate overreach it represented, then you ought to be outraged by President Trump's FCC and the heavy-handed corporate overreach Chairman Pai has been all too familiar representing. The corporate Democrats don't exactly get a free pass on this either. I was disappointed to find out that it was President Obama who initially appointed Ajit Pai as an FCC commissioner back in 2012. Although I questioned that decision, it doesn't change the almost comedic irony that promoting the telecom profit attorney to chair the FCC is like allowing the Star Wars Dark Sith Lord to train the younglings at the Jedi Temple. If you only knew the power of the dark side. However, in spite the millions of Americans outraged by Chairman Pai's push to neuter net neutrality with his awkward fetishes for light touch regulations, his hijacking of the very definition of open internet, and his blessing of the unholy Sinclair Tribune matrimony, Trump's pro forma promises to fight for American democracy predictably has all but gone limp. This is proof positive that once again the corporatocracy and Trump's Ministry of Truth only look to serve each other's agenda. Chairman Pai's degrading open internet policy will only be as open as the Patriot Act is patriotic, marinated and stuffed with enough loopholes and controls for the establishment that eventually it will cannibalize its namesake, earning a more fitting title, Open Casket Internet. Dun, dun, dun. Surely such heinous acts and contempt for the will of the people must be considered a dereliction of duty, a malfeasance, and at minimum grounds for Chairman Pai's removal from office. Therefore, I recommend we each follow up a simple plan of action I'm calling Don't FCC with My Net Neutrality. Don't FCC with My Net Neutrality. Number 1, demand that President Trump fire Chairman Pai and fire all commissioners who voted against the Internet's Title II status, or we will not re-elect him for president. Additionally, should the movement for his impeachment go forward, we will join rank and add our efforts to that cause. We also demand that Commissioner Clyburn be designated as the new FCC chairwoman, since she has dissented Pi's campaign from the very beginning. Number 2, demand that our senators and representatives call for Pi's resignation and the resignation of all commissioners who voted against the Internet's Title II status, or we will not re-elect them. Number 3, boycott the Internet service providers who supported Chairman Pai and his efforts to downgrade our Title II protections. Additionally, we demand that these Internet service providers follow the same guidelines as the Title II protections, subject to unannounced audits to verify the authenticity of reports and transparencies. Number 4, pledge to do business with ISPs who follow the same guidelines as the Title II protections, being subject to unannounced audits to verify the authenticity of reports and transparencies. Number 5, and probably the most poignant one, Number 5, demand our government approve and build out a new publicly owned and operated internet service provider that will perform at or better than a Title II status, higher quality and performance levels, more transparencies, etc. Comparable to the Revelation model's free healthcare and free education will be the RM's free access to information. That means a free Title II internet. Ultimately, this will keep all major private ISPs in check, letting them know, don't FCC with my net neutrality. And just as the Revelation model recognizes the right for private banks to remain private, so will the RM recognize the right for private ISPs to remain private. Similarly, the more these private ISPs operate at or better than the performance and transparency levels of the public ISP, the more the private ISPs will get paid. I hope by now you can all see that the construction of a public ISP can be placed on fast track when we decide to implement the RM, especially since its second pillar will expand our constitutional right to create, issue, and control the money and credit systems. Paralleling the people's control over money is the people's control over information. They both weave and flow in tandem in more ways than one. In fact, I profoundly believe both to be identical twins. Money is meant to serve the people, not for us to feel enslaved by it. Equally so is the intention of information and intellectual property. Its primary role is to benefit us all, earthlings in all varieties, organic and inorganic alike. To best represent this intention for information, we must enact the next pillar. Pillar 3, the culture of transparency and sharing. Open patents, sources, information, open everything, along with the free, public, neutral internet. The simple reason our world is in this predicament has much to do with the unabated culture of selfishness we've all been stomaching. Ergo, we are long overdue for a correction of epic proportions. And just as easy to see, our saving grace demands a sharing atmosphere. It makes sense for the pendulum to swing back the other direction, only to maintain an acceptable range of balance. Not to swing the pendulum carelessly to the opposite end, where we lose the rational benefit of incentives, or the hive mind and homogeny creates a deficit of individuality. No, such an extreme would likewise be an error in judgment. The objective for the Revelation model, if you would so allow, is to strike a chord in each of you to rebuild this culture of sharing, to draft the framework that will temper our vices, to consolidate our diverse pool of resources, talents, advantages, and efforts toward acceptable ranges imperative for both safety nets and incentives, to redefine our highest standards of living, and to further amend our constitutions toward reconciling the biases, ill conditions, and challenges plaguing our current time in history, as our founding fathers and mothers charged us to do. In retrospect, let's look at the tax bill, for example. To increase transparency, it should have programmed the guidelines of the proposed tax bill into the formula used to calculate our actual taxes. Then allow us to backtest these bills such that each individual or household can log on to their own IRS online account and transpose the tax returns of prior years onto any new proposed tax bill. Then generate each of our projected tax returns. So if a tax bill has certain beneficial rates falling off after 10 years, the software would project calculations 20 years out for good measure. The program should include the projected decrease in tax revenues for all the tax breaks given to the wealthy throughout those 20 years. The program should compare the 20-year projections of both the proposed tax bill and the current taxation formula as a type of control or baseline. Of course, all proposed bills, not just limited to tax bills, should go through the same rigorous format, thus providing the people with a transparent model to compare the various bills introduced into Congress. As good as the Congressional Budget Office is, the individual hearts and minds of citizens, however, can better be convinced by going online themselves and plugging in figures that directly involve their own individual and household budgets. This culture of transparency and sharing will be so open that Congress will not be allowed to vote on any proposed bill outside of an emergency unless we, the people, first get our just review of those bills. And because we will place a premium on transparency, balancing the viewpoints and deliberating our positions, ultimately, we will better grasp the goal of becoming the best informed voters we can be, making the best decisions for our individual selves and our families. In this way, we adhere to core libertarian values, which the Revelation model will preserve. Libertarians will be able to weigh in on the details of auditing this system and assess its performance to keep our private information out of public view. Additionally, it will be up to the individual as to whether or not certain private information will remain private or be shared with the public domain, such as a music software analyzing pools of its subscribers to generate a list of recommended songs unique to a user, or a computer virus protection program analyzing various threats from its subscribers for better defensive measures to eventually update their software with. Information will be used to improve the lives of the public at large. No longer will it be mined for a coterie of profiteers. Certainly, the voters must discuss and decide on the details of discerning private information to use for the public good. To get an idea of how to even begin this debate, we need to agree on a baseline of exactly how current information is being managed. Therefore, all businesses and organizations must drop the legalese in their terms and conditions agreement and educate the masses on their practices and the specifics of how our information is being stored and used, including how these organizations are currently benefiting from them. Again, full disclosure will be rewarded handsomely, and regardless of the corporate media spin, whistleblowers like Edward Snowden do spark an essential debate and discussion on how we can best indemnify society from the follies of pseudo-security measures, externalities, cover-ups, and the blood of corporate liabilities partially washed away by the tepid waters enforcing legislation. Once we control the money system, we can effectively encourage full disclosure and the optimal utility of information and patents, bringing into reality the much anticipated culture of sharing, wisdom, and compassion. These virtues, ever present with our founding fathers, shining brightly as the constellations, guiding our integrity's true north, is evidenced in the spirit of their writ. In 1742, after inventing an open stove to better warm the room, then publishing its details on a pamphlet, Founding Father Benjamin Franklin wrote in his autobiography, Governor Thomas was so pleased with the construction of the stove, as described in it, that he offered to give me a patent for the sole vending of them for a term of years. But I declined it, from a principle which has ever weighed with me on such occasions, viz., that as we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously. An ironmonger in London, however, assuming a good deal of my pamphlet and working it up into his own, and making some small changes in the machine which rather hurt its operation, got a patent for it there, and made, as I was told, a little fortune by it. And this is not the only instance of patents taken out for my inventions by others, though not always with the same success, which I never contested, as having no desire of profiting by patents myself and hating disputes. The use of these fireplaces in very many houses, both of this and the neighboring colonies, has been and is a great saving of wood to the inhabitants. On August 13, 1813, decades after he served as our first Secretary of State, leading the Patent Review Board from 1790 to 1793, and after he served as our third president, Founding Father Thomas Jefferson wrote back to Isaac McPherson, a Baltimore miller and manufacturer, in response to his letter regarding patents. The University of Chicago Press published this reply letter where Jefferson states, "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me. That ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe for the moral and mutual instruction of man and improvement of his condition seems to have been particularly and benevolently designed by nature when she made them, like fire, expansive over all space without lessening their density in any point, and, like the air in which we breathe, move and have our physical being incapable of confinement or exclusive appropriation. Inventions, then, cannot in nature be a subject of property. Society may give an exclusive right to the profits arising from them as an encouragement to men to pursue ideas which may produce utility, but this may or may not be done according to the will and convenience of the society without claim or complaint from anybody. Accordingly, it is a fact, as far as I am informed, that England was, until we copied her, the only country on earth which ever, by general law, gave a legal right to the exclusive use of an idea. In some other countries it is sometimes done in a great case, and by a special and personal act, but, generally speaking, other nations have thought that these monopolies produce more embarrassment than advantage to society, and it may be observed that the nations which refuse monopolies of invention are as fruitful as England in new and useful devices. Jefferson, the first to purely interpret the authority to examine patents, was noted for his strict manner in granting them, leaving many applications for patents without exception to the nature of commerce and the sharing of ideas. Juxtapose the sophistries of a patent system alive today. The stark contrast alone suggests a new order gone mad. Now we bear witness to the innovations of the elite devolved into frivolous patent trolling schemes, financial vehicles they typically park in tax shelters, investments for corporations disguised as campaign donations, no doubt to unite citizens against their own interests. Teams of lobbyists and lawyers writing legislation to protect and proliferate the bottom line of the filthy rich. The current capitalism is a hoarder's paradise, paralyzing gapers onlooking severe inequality worldwide. Another innovation is to suppress beneficial information. Banks cook the books. Tobaccos are cancerous crooks. Big Pharma rigs their data. Vaccines have been empirical autism machines. GMO food gives your DNA attitude. Low-cost auto safety violations are equivalent to deregulation. The military-industrial complex speaks for itself. Marco Rubio sabotaged the calculations of Obamacare, which elevated premiums and deductible into a nightmare. How about innovations where established companies suddenly change their names to transfer their liabilities and externalities onto taxpayers like you and me? Or innovate municipal and individual taxpayer restrictions from having the same bankruptcy protections as corporations? Do these innovations warrant enough American pride to send our children into war and protect the establishment's lie? Although I believe our convictions for a culture of sharing, openness, and transparency will eventually lead the way to free energy, which will undoubtedly free us from the scourge of pollution and climate change, free ourselves from the tar pits of war for oil. Perhaps one of the greatest crimes against humanity is suppressing these technologies and innovations that would have freed us from the addiction to fossil fuels. Confessions of a complex of interests needing to prop up the petrodollar as the type of meddling, fueling the hitman's terror, flames the horseman's eye for war, terror with anti-terror, both reflections one and the same of this black liquid mirror. In an interview a few years back, David Wilcock, author of the Sourcefield Investigations, referred to the Federation of American Scientists and said, "There's been over 5,000 patents that were classified for national security, and this includes automatically any patents that gets above 70% efficiency in converting energy is automatically classified." So what that means is anybody who invents anything that could challenge oil, you will never see. And all that stuff needs to be released. On October of 2016, the Federation of American Scientists published an article that stated there were 5,680 invention secrecy orders in effect at the end of the fiscal year 2016. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office reported that 121 new secrecy orders were issued in 2016, but also that 20 existing orders were rescinded, for a net increase of 101 over the year before. The latest figures were released under the Freedom of Information Act. The government may impose a secrecy order on a patent application under the Invention Secrecy Act of 1951 if it believes that disclosure of the underlying invention would be detrimental to national security. Under those circumstances, a patent is withheld and the inventor is prohibited from revealing the invention unless and until the secrecy order is withdrawn. Clearly, the culture of sharing for the greater good is somewhat fading into a lost art, acquiescing instead to the corporate commercial culture of self-aggrandizement. I suppose greed can be characterized as a type of psychosis where guilt is lobotomized from the embarrassment of riches, and not to be outdone by other inmates of the asylum stricken with the same disorder. This departure gives rise to the requisite that holding society first must amass a resounding force of resilience, a solid base to rein back the loosened patent laws that allow the establishment's lust for power to calcify. Only when we reform the privileges of intellectual property into a system that rights the wrongs of our past can we begin our journey toward reconciliation, healing, and peace. Such a reform devoted to the strengthening of our union, moved by the assemblage of her people, is inextricable to the security of our nation, despite any attempts from whom President Eisenhower referred to as the military-industrial complex to suggest it as otherwise. Using innovation and information to advance society under our terms is not detrimental. In fact, it ensures our national security. Not to paint too rosy a picture, a potential caveat looming ahead of this road is having to strike a deal with the establishment and those hiding in the shadows of government to release the over 5,000 secrecy orders and thousands of other private corporate patents that would better all of humanity. At first, paving a non-detrimental pathway for the cabal may seem nauseating. However, the medicinal relief of pragmatism is time released in favor for all of mankind. That being said, our best hand at the negotiating table can only be played by first exploring and enacting the pillars of the revelation model. So how would it look like if we were to reform the patent system under the revelation model? Well, I may be biased. However, I do believe it would resemble what our founding fathers Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin had envisioned as the natural order of patents. New intellectual properties of elements, processes, and products can quickly be applied to the products of others unrestricted. Each competitive interest can build on the successes of one another, such that inventories of products and services can be improved upon in a flash. The universal single payer will disperse royalties to the patent holder based on the successes of the patent user or licensee, such that the more one's patent is used and copied with high levels of performance, the more the patent holder will be paid, not by the patent user or licensee, but again by the universal single payer. Independently, the universal single payer will compensate the patent user or licensee for the successes of their product and service undiminished for having used someone else's patents. Of course, this kind of open patent system will be the breath of life for Pillar 1's supply-demand-resupply inventory network. The success of this inventory is dependent on our new economic paradigm for sharing information and ideas, as well as other pillars of the revelation model. Quite simply put, no sharing, no inventory. I do believe, though, that overcoming the establishment will require part, if not all, the pillars of the revelation model, giving me hope, fueling my optimism, and sustaining my vigor to press forward the banners of victory for all the peoples of humanity. One day, our culture will be so adept at sharing that all computer languages from all information systems, from all business models, will be able to network with and audit the same inventory, such that ordering any product and service will be almost as convenient as thought itself. Although the culture of sharing spans far and wide, across multitudes of aspects in varying degrees, the overarching theme, the spirit that bridges all our individual experiences and interests together into one collective hub, is transparency. Fully disclosed, transparency is light and truth, the alpha and the omega. However, we as humans have had a history of blocking, bending, and blurring the light. The following examples highlight some of these illusions. In Josh Fox's lit documentary Gasland, Josh reported that in 2004, the Environmental Protection Agency was investigating water contamination incidences due to hydraulic fracturing across the country. But a panel rejected the inquiry, stating that Although hazardous materials were being injected underground, the EPA did not need to investigate. Weston Wilson, a 20-year veteran of the EPA, not speaking on behalf of the EPA, wrote a letter to Congress objecting. He also noted that on the peer review panel that authored the report, 5 of the 7 members appeared to have conflicts of interest and would have benefited from the EPA's decision not to conduct a further investigation. During the interview, Weston said they came out with a patently ridiculous conclusion. They had showed it was toxic and then said it wasn't a risk. It made no sense, and only in an Orwellian world would you accept that. Josh continued, from 1995 until 2000, when he became vice president, Dick Cheney was the CEO of Halliburton. One of the first things he did when he became vice president was to form what was known as the Energy Task Force. They met up to 40 times with industry leaders. They only met once with members from environmental groups. The Energy Task Force and a $100 million lobbying effort on behalf of the industry were significant in the passage of what's called the Halliburton Loophole to the Safe Drinking Water Act, which authorizes oil and gas drillers exclusively to inject known hazardous materials unchecked directly into or adjacent to underground drinking water supplies. It passed as part of the Bush administration's Energy Policy Act of 2005. Later, Weston remarked sarcastically, "When the president says to its bureaucracy, 'Don't investigate, expedite things for industry,' we do those things well too. One can characterize this entire industry as having 100 years of history of purchasing those they contaminate." So they purchase the land, and often with an agreement of secrecy, of somebody that's alleging they've been contaminated by oil and gas production. The industry itself has that type of practice. So the onus should be on the industry to prove to the government that their practice is benign, and not that assumption. Even if the allegations, weren't true, they deserve an investigation. They're citizens of the United States. And they certainly don't deserve to be exposed to secret chemicals. It's un-American. So I understand your question and your frustration, and you're seeing how this may be a pattern repeating itself. But so far, we're not on duty. We're not present as a government agency to answer your legitimate questions, and we must be directed to. Then, Josh interviewed the highly acclaimed environmental health analyst, Dr. Theo Colborn, who said, "We've begun to look at what's being used to drill a well. Data that government should be collecting but isn't collecting. We've been able to get our hands on some of that." Josh summarized, "Because of their exemptions, fracking chemicals are considered proprietary, like the special sauce of a Big Mac or the secret formula for Coca-Cola. The only reason we know anything about fracking chemicals is because of the work of Theo Colborn. By chasing down trucks, combing through material safety data sheets, and collecting samples, Theo has identified 596 different chemicals in 900 chemical products. Every environmental law we wrote to protect public health is ignored, but the neurological effects are very insidious," Dr. Colborn revealed as she continued. "At first, you may just have headaches. Next thing, you might have ringing in your ears, or you may be a little disoriented, or you may feel a little dizzy, but eventually, you may feel what is called peripheral neuropathy. And when you get to this stage, you have irreversible brain damage. You may begin to get swelling, your extremities, especially in the arms and legs, and never know where the pain is going to be. The pain can be excruciating. Think about the workers or the people whose yards are within 1,000 feet of their home have a well pad. They're inhaling these chemicals 24/7, around the clock. I go out and I talk to the bosses, the men who are overlooking what's going on, and even their supervisors, the public relations people that talk to us from the industry. They are so surprised. They look at me as if I'm crazy when I ask them, what are they mixing in the chemicals right now? Oh, we're not mixing any chemicals. Well, if we are, they're safe. Even the bosses don't know what they're telling those men to handle. Once the public hears the story, and they'll say, well, why aren't we out there monitoring? We can't monitor. Until we know what they're using, there's no way to monitor. You can't. The current obsolete model drapes a shroud of secrecy over its profits, its interests, and over the unsuspecting faithful eyes of its victims. Similarly, profit-based and budget-based operations are somewhat mirror images of one another, since both require bank financing to expand their services when customer sales, rents, tax revenues, issuing shares, and existing bonds aren't enough. So when cases surface from municipal budgetary restrictions, adorning the public with a veil of ignorance cloaks her view as well as her bliss. A Chicago Tribune article published in August 2011 stated, city officials were prompted to start testing for substances after the Tribune found trace amounts of pharmaceuticals, residue from personal care products, and unregulated industrial chemicals in local tap water. Substances found in the city's latest tests include the sex hormones testosterone and progesterone, gemfibrozil, a prescription cholesterol-fighting drug, and DEET, the active ingredient in bug spray. The test also found perfluorooctane sulfonate, an ingredient in Scotchgard stain-fighting coatings, bisphenol A, a hormone-like plastic additive, and tris-2-butoxyethyl phosphate, a flame-retardant chemical. Little is known about potential health effects from drinking drug-contaminated water, but scientists and regulators increasingly are concerned about long-term exposure even at very low levels. We need to start addressing the cumulative effects that these low-dose exposures could be having on people, said Thomas Burke, Associate Dean of Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. There are no quick solutions, said Burke, who chaired a National Academy of Sciences committee that called for a dramatic overhaul of the way the U.S. regulates toxic chemicals. But we need a new approach that is more responsive to emerging science. Exposure to some of these chemicals is cause for consternation for people and concern over fish and wildlife impacts, said Rebecca Clapper, a researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee who studies the Great Lakes. The EPA's position is that it doesn't yet have enough evidence to limit pharmaceuticals and many other unregulated chemicals in drinking water. Water officials say not enough is known to justify spending millions of taxpayer dollars to upgrade treatment plants. In contrast, the Revelation model's objectives for transparency and improving society will justify the funding needed to study the long-term effects of these low-level toxins, as well as the funding needed to immediately upgrade our water treatment plants. Laborers in the energy sector, as I alluded to earlier, will have complete health and economic protection as they seal and secure the gas and oil wells. Afterwards, they'll have the freedom to choose and begin training on other vocations that improve the trends for a safer, more sustainable world. Curing all symptoms brought on by the systemic cancer that is this current economic experiment run amok is no easy task. Two ill-addressed industries in particular are contributing to untold catastrophic levels of harm. They are the food and drug industries, which is ironic because the father of medicine, Hippocrates, whose oath abstains from doing harm, has been quoted as saying, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." A farmer, Joel Stolatin of Polyface Farms, boldly summarized the American system in the Oscar-nominated documentary Food, Inc. Stolatin said, "We're willing to subsidize the food system to create the mystique of cheap food, when actually it's very expensive food when you add up the environmental costs, societal costs, health costs. The industrial food is not honest food. It's not priced honestly, it's not produced honestly, it's not processed honestly. There's nothing honest about that food." For a more in-depth analysis, here are some excerpts from a brilliant February 1999 article published in the Chronicle of Higher Education entitled "Patents on Cells, Genes, and Organisms Undermine the Exchange of Scientific Ideas." An unforeseen and deeply troubling aspect of this commercialization, however, is the transformation of biological entities, the products of hundreds of millions of years of evolution, into private property. This is taking place through a radical extension of patent law to encompass gene sequences, isolated cells and tissues, genetically engineered animals, and even natural species. Furthermore, in spite of widespread opposition to such life patents in many other countries, the U.S. government, in response to pressures from corporations in the United States, is seeking to force all countries to accept U.S.-style patent laws. For example, the government threatened to end science and technology agreements with India unless the Indian patent laws were extended to cover pharmaceutical and agriculture products. For instance, Monsanto owns a patent covering all genetically engineered cotton, and Duke University has patented genes involved in Alzheimer's disease. Human Genome Sciences has patented the entire genomes of certain bacteria that can cause serious disease in humans to gain a monopoly on the development of new antibacterial agents. Myriad Genetics owns patents on the human genes that, when damaged, lead to breast cancer. And Axis Pharmaceuticals has applied for patents on the cells and genes of New Guinea tribes for their presumed value in the development of certain treatments against viruses to which the tribes may have developed immunities. U.S. law permits the owner of a patent to prevent others from using or benefiting from the subject of the patent without the owner's permission for 20 years. After that time, the patented material enters the public domain. However, it is common for patent holders to modify their inventions and apply for additional patents. This 200-year-old legacy was breached in 1980 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Diamond versus Chakrabarty that an applicant could patent a genetically engineered bacterium. The court's decision was very close. 4 of the 9 justices dissented from the majority's opinion, and it was narrowly written to only apply to genetically modified microorganisms. However, since the decision, under pressure from pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and agrotechnology companies, the Patent Office has issued patents on plants, animals, genes, and human cell lines. Patent laws are passed, modified, and superseded by Congress just as other laws are. They are means to social progress, not an end in themselves. Congress should amend the existing patent laws to explicitly exclude life patents. The life patents already granted threaten to obstruct scientific and technological research. The biotechnology revolution in the United States was a product of research, most of it sponsored by the federal government since World War II, at colleges, universities, and medical schools throughout the nation. The free communication and exchange of materials and ideas were essential to that research. Scientists already communicated major advances, such as the determination of the amino acid sequences that make up protein chains, information that any scientist could use in future research. The enormous inventiveness of that period flourished without patent protections granted to individuals or companies. Now that life patents are being rewarded, however, patent attorneys regularly advise researchers to limit what they tell their colleagues about their work before they apply for a patent. Life patents may also interfere with the delivery of healthcare. Patent monopolies lead to higher costs for drug and treatments, which price them out of many patients' reach. And they retard the development of products that are more efficient and cost less. For example, Genentech has repeatedly charged other companies with patent infringement when they have produced more sophisticated forms of a clot-dissolving protein patented by Genentech. Healthy competition is particularly at risk in the seed industry. Patents on plants deprive farmers of free access to an essential public resource, crop seed. Farmers for millennia have saved the seed of their harvests for replanting the following year, and they continue to do so even in the industrialized agricultural systems of the United States. Patents on seeds are a legal means to make sure farmers buy seed every year. Since the Monsanto Corporation began marketing genetically engineered cotton and soybeans, it has investigated 475 farmers suspected of saving seed from the patented plants. Some of the farmers who were found to have violated patents have had to pay Monsanto tens of thousands of dollars each. The United States government and the United Nations have recognized the necessity of protecting essential common resources, such as the oceans, the atmosphere, and the moon, from national sovereignty or private ownership. Surely, the Earth's life forms should be in the same category. Although that article was published almost 20 years ago in 1999, its message holds relevant and true today. The Food Inc. documentary also included an interview with the author, journalist, activist, and a previous UC Berkeley professor of journalism, Michael Pollan, who claimed there have been this revolving door between Monsanto's corporate offices and the various regulatory and judicial bodies that have made the key decisions. Justice Clarence Thomas was a Monsanto attorney. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote the majority of opinion in a case that allowed these companies to prevent these farmers from saving their own seed. Monsanto had very close ties to the Bush administration. Donald Rumsfeld, Searle Pharmaceuticals CEO, bought by Monsanto. Missouri Senator John Ashcroft received record donations from Monsanto. And the Clinton administration. Mickey Cantor, a Monsanto board of director. Robert Shapiro, a Monsanto CEO on President Clinton's advisory board. The video touched on other topics, stating, "It is incredible that the FDA wants to allow the sale of meat from cloned animals without further research, but also wants to allow the sale of this meat without any labels." These companies fight tooth and nail against labeling. The fast food industry fought against giving you the calorie information. They fought against telling you if there's trans fat in your food. The meatpacking industry for years prevented the country of origin labeling. They fought not to label genetically modified foods. And now 78% of processed foods in the supermarket has some genetically modified ingredient. Michael Pollan claimed that we've had a food system that's been dedicated to a single virtue of efficiency, not diversity. So we grow a very small number of crops with a very small number of variety, a very small number of companies. Now, even though you achieve efficiencies, the system gets more and more precarious, highlighting the jeopardy of monoculture. You will have a breakdown eventually, And where the breakdown comes in this system, you don't always know. Modern production agriculture depends on large amounts of petroleum. One farmer says that his farm uses about 40,000 gallons of diesel a year. We eat a lot of oil without knowing it. To bring the steer to slaughter, you use about 75 gallons of oil. In the quest for a solution, as another farmer put it, people have got to start demanding good, wholesome food with us. And we'll deliver. I promise you, we're very ingenious people. We'll deliver. Under the revelation model's culture of sharing and transparency, not only will we cease and desist all corporate practices of capturing its regulators, we will use any and all resources to open up patents, from providing incentives to rolling back policies to repealing and replacing. Whatever it takes, we'll do it. So to the food and drug industries, you're all on notice. Any corporation's hegemony over life patents and seeds will themselves be terminated. No longer will the monopolization and monoculture of our food supply be permitted. As a matter of fact, we'll bring back the public seed planting programs. So all you farmers out there, get ready and fire up them seed cleaners. At the end of the day, whether you are society's salt of the earth or an A-list superstar, the revelation model will reconcile your grievances. For instance, Robert De Niro's plea to investigate why so many people claim their children are diagnosed with autism after getting vaccinated will be honored. John and Tracy Stewart's encouragement of farm sanctuaries. Beyonce's flawless Time for Change campaign to promote female empowerment. Bono and U2's pledge to end poverty. Ted Danson's passion to curb climate change. George Clooney's charity work to stop human rights atrocities in Darfur. Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt's humanitarian work, from assisting orphans around the world, HIV patients in Africa, refugees in the Middle East, to hurricane victims in Louisiana, entertainers and sports phenoms alike. Their entire wish list to make the world a better place will be revisited and addressed with the revelation model's leverage for economic and political change. As global and national citizens, we know all too well the current system and its culture are obsolete. If we stay shackled on our knees working for this economic experiment, then the probability of timelines can only frame doomsday-like scenarios, similar to the movie Mad Max. All this in a relatively short amount of time, perhaps 30 to 60 years. This injustice is unacceptable. Enough is enough. We must double and triple our efforts, peacefully, protesting, demanding our referendums be met, and calling for a global convention. Ultimately, our culture, supported by the pillars of the revelation model, will allow us to heal the traumas woven with the strands of our DNA into the exquisite tapestry that is our beloved human history. The revelation model will spin the wheels of reconciliation, remove the blockages of karma, and guide the generations and our collective soul to live within the most optimal timeline. The first three of these pillars being Pillar 1, the resource-oriented economy to peg our currencies with, and the supply-demand-resupply inventory network as the job creator. Pillar 2, the people's power over money and credit, using public banks along with the universal single-payer system to compensate us all. Pillar 3, the culture of transparency and sharing, meaning open patents, open sources, open information, open everything, along with the free, public, neutral internet. Will first initiate the resource-oriented economy with a financial stimulus of the people's money from zero interest loans via the nationwide creation of public banks. Then everyone will collaborate in tandem to construct the supply-demand-resupply inventory network via transparency and the sharing of information. We will receive income from the universal single-payer system through our public bank's usage of the people's financial stimulus. I hope and pray that by envisioning these pillars working in concert, you will dream of a brighter tomorrow, that you will hold the brilliance of that light to anchor and become the new heaven and the new earth our Holy Scriptures once prophesied. By having the proper incentives to open our patents, share our ideas, and peer review our combined data and methods of best practices, we will hone in and become better decision makers, thus better informed voters, better workers in better health, better adjusted to our diverse wealth. To each of us are joyful ends justified by overjoyous societal means. This promised land, this golden age for all of man, is much closer than it seems. This revelation I share with you. Should it call to you as it does to me, then in kind share this message to all in your light with whomever you may be. Peace be with you. Final statement. As solid as these three pillars are, they alone are not enough to stabilize and fulfill the new era for humanity. There are still many questions to be answered. How to distribute goods and services in a way that we preserve the strengths of capitalism and avoid the pitfalls of socialism. How to responsibly transition into the new economy such that the winners of those who enjoy today's lion's share can likewise have a successful transition. And even if the resource-oriented economy could temper inflation, how will we prevent hyper-austerity? How should America regard and respond to China's petro-yuan and the One Belt, One Road campaign in a manner that will take any covert operation of war off the table? Become familiar with the Revelation model and join me in the coming videos and articles as I will address all these questions and more. Thank you very much for watching this extensive video. Certainly, future videos will be much more brief. If you really love what you've heard so far, please share, subscribe to, like this video, and add this to your playlist. Check out my playlist of like-minded videos and share some of your videos with me. And of course, I'd love to read your comments. Please translate this video to other languages and let's make this go viral. By ascending the culture of economics and politics, we'll be ascending the globe as one. One world, one love, baby.